Welcome, brave souls, to Fear File Chronicles, your one-way ticket to spine-chilling stories and terrifying tales. Tonight, we'll be diving into the darkest corners of the human mind with the story, Hallowed Ground. The complete story, parts 1 through 7, penned by the twisted mind of the Vespers Bell. Together, we'll explore the unexplained and face our deepest fears. But before we begin, if you enjoy trembling in terror, be sure to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fear fanatics, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click the bell notification so you never miss an eerie episode. Your support truly means the world to us. So feel free to leave a comment below to join the Fear File Chronicles community. Now, without further ado, let's unravel the mysteries of the unknown together as we delve into tonight's fear-inducing story, Hallowed Ground, the complete story, parts 1 through 7. Dim the lights and prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the Fear File Chronicles. I don't think there's anything more beautiful than a cemetery in the fall. Though I love cemeteries, no matter the season. There's normally an abundance of majestically tall trees, more than you typically find in a public park, but not so many that they obstruct your view, like in the woods. At the peak of autumn, you're treated to a panoramic vista of vibrantly colored foliage, dangling from the branches and blanketing the ground, rustling in the wind and crunching underfoot. The gravestones themselves have an apothic allure to them. Ruggedly cut slabs of polished slate or granite or marble, their dark bodies glistening ever so slightly in the dappled sunlight, meticulously arranged row by row in solemn respect to those they stand in memorial to. What I love the most, though, is the serenity, the tranquility, the quiet. Aside from the occasional funeral, they're often entirely empty of visitors and virtually never have more than a few at a time. The memento mori of rotting corpses only 6 feet underground must sour most people on the otherwise gorgeous landscaping. Not me, though. I guess I'm something of a misanthropic loner to seek out solitude in the confines of a graveyard. But reminders of mortality don't bother me. It's comforting, if anything, that we set aside such charming sanctuaries for the dead. It was on the first day of October 2018 that I came across a new cemetery. One I had never been to before or even knew existed. I was taking a scenic route home along the countryside roads to admire the fall landscape when I spotted the weathered gravestones up ahead. Pleasantly surprised at my discovery, I turned in without a second thought. The corroded metal arch over the gates only read cemetery. If the sign had ever borne a name, those letters had long since rusted away. It wasn't a large cemetery. Maybe a little over 100 yards across by a couple hundred long with a single looping gravel path. So I parked my car and explored it on foot. I was immediately enthralled by its pristine silence. I couldn't hear even the most distant sign of human activity. The only noises were the cawing of crows, the scampering of small animals, and the wind blowing through the trees. The towering oaks and maples that populated the graveyard were stunningly dressed in their fall colors beneath the somber gray sky. But the gravestones themselves were a different story. None of them were recent, and most were so worn they couldn't even be read anymore. There were only 2 structures still standing upon the grounds: the dilapidated remains of a maintenance shed and a small marble mausoleum, my entrance barred by an iron gate. I walked the entire length of the cemetery, searching for any sign of recent activity. Plant overgrowth was limited, but that looked more like the work of grazing wildlife than a groundskeeper, and I came to the conclusion the place must be abandoned. I was ecstatic. A small, quaint, aged cemetery all to myself. I came back a couple of days later and reclined up against a large gravestone that I thought gave the best view, with a book in one hand and a pumpkin spice latte in the other. I wasn't usually so casual about my behavior in cemeteries, in case someone came across me and deemed it disrespectful. but after a brief web search on Ecosia yielded absolutely nothing about the cemetery. I was certain it was abandoned. If there's one thing people find creepier than cemeteries, it's abandoned, isolated, decaying cemeteries. I was quite confident that I wouldn't be bothered, and that the long-forgotten person beneath me would be grateful for any attention at all after such prolonged neglect. Once I had finished my drink and a couple of chapters of my book, I decided to get up and stretch my legs a bit. I nearly screamed out loud when I saw a man in a long black coat and wide-brimmed hat standing over a grave near the cemetery exit. In a more ordinary cemetery, his presence wouldn't have been much cause for concern. But I was so utterly convinced that this place had been abandoned for ages that it seemed next to impossible that he was just paying his respects. My mind immediately assumed the worst, that he had seen me come in here and hoped to take advantage of my isolated state. If I were to scream at the top of my lungs out here, would anyone else even hear it? I dropped back down behind the gravestone, waiting to see what he would do. He continued standing over the same grave, barely moving, and giving no indication that he even knew I was there. I pulled out my phone in the hopes of calling someone to pick me up, only to see that I had no reception. Not entirely unexpected, given the rural area I was in, but I still cursed my luck. 20 minutes to half an hour went by with no change, and I realized it was going to start getting dark soon. I decided it was better to walk past this guy in daylight than to risk being trapped with him in a graveyard at night. And it wasn't like I was completely defenseless either. Being a woman with a penchant for wandering by herself in lonely areas, I had made it a habit to carry a small can of mace on my person, and I had taken some basic self-defense classes. Gathering my things with my mace concealed in the palm of my hand, I set off towards the exit, following the route that kept me the furthest from the stranger. I kept my gait steady, my breathing soft and level, and my gaze ever flicking back and forth between my car and the dark figure. At the sound of my footfalls drawing near, he listlessly lifted his head, gave a perfunctory nod, and, to my great relief, let me pass without incident. A few days went by before I went back to the cemetery. My encounter with the stranger had left me a bit spooked, but since he'd done nothing to actually threaten me, maybe his presence there had been innocent after all. All I knew was that the spot was far too beautiful and secluded to give up without a more tangible threat to my safety. I went out for another leisurely country drive that eventually took me back to the cemetery, and as soon as I pulled into the entrance, there he was again. Or possibly, there he was still, since he was standing over the exact same grave with his back to me. Part of me wanted to back up and get the hell out of there. But at that point, I honestly was more curious than scared. If he had intended to do me harm, he could have done it the first time we were in the cemetery together. And it didn't really make any sense that he would be lurking out in the open to ambush me days later, on the off chance that I would come back. So, what the hell was he doing then? And how did he get here? I didn't see any other vehicles around, though that had escaped my attention during our first encounter. Now that I wasn't cornered, he didn't look nearly as threatening as he had before. Instead, he seemed a forlorn, almost tragic figure standing over that grave. My curiosity was piqued, and I was resolved not to give up the cemetery. So, I decided to speak with him, shooting off a text to an acquaintance as a minimal precaution, which didn't send immediately thanks to the poor reception, and palming my mace, I stepped out of my vehicle and approached him. As I neared, confidence surged within me. Noticing his coat added a significant illusion of bulk. In reality, he was a frail man. His cheekbones, sharp and pronounced, towered over sunken cheeks, and under his eyes lay dark circles. His skin was pale yet strangely. It bore an almost silvery luster. His hair was a stark white, a hue too bright for someone who seemed no older than 50. But his eyes were the most peculiar feature. They were an incredibly vibrant shade of green, like two beryl gemstones embedded in his silvery white face. A shame, I thought, that such beautiful eyes might need to be met with mace. Not that it would deter me. Excuse me, sir," I managed to utter. stopping a few feet away. He lifted his head towards me, a stern melancholy etched onto his otherwise friendly face. I apologize if I'm intruding, but I saw you by this grave a few days ago. These graves all seem too ancient for anyone alive to have known the buried. I was just curious about why you're here. He nodded, seemingly cognizant of the peculiarities of his actions.
The person buried here is an ancestor of mine. Never knew them personally, but their deeds have resonated throughout my family for generations, and it's our tradition to honor them for that.
He explained, his voice hoarse.
I'm the last of my bloodline now, so the honor falls to me alone.
I cast my gaze onto the moss-covered grave, scrutinizing as best I could. I could discern no identifying features other than the outline of a cross. There was a solitary purple rose on the ground, and a few silver dollars laid along the base of the gravestone.
What about you, miss?
He inquired.
What brings you to this place?
Oh, I just like cemeteries, I confessed sheepishly. They're pretty and quiet. He nodded, a faint smirk playing on his lips. How did you get here? I asked. Did someone drop you off, or do you live nearby?
The latter. Very much so.
He acknowledged, pointing towards a towering evergreen tree. Beneath its sagging branches lay a tent and several plastic totes and canvas bags. Oh, you're squatting here? I asked, as sympathetically as possible. To my relief, his homelessness seemed to explain his emaciated frame, ill-fitting coat, and prematurely white hair, but we're miles from the nearest store. You don't walk all the way there and then haul supplies all the way back, do you?
I have enough to last me till the end of the month. After that, it won't matter.
I pondered what he meant, but decided against prying further. His mental state was a mystery, especially considering the humble grave he claimed as his ancestors. I found it best to let him hold on to his beliefs. I slipped the mace back into my pocket and brought out my coin purse. May I? I gestured to the row of coins at the base of the gravestone. He nodded in approval, and I left a small offering for his ancestor. Or perhaps him. Is it all right with you if I keep visiting? I really do like it here.
It's not my cemetery, miss. Do as you please.
He agreed. Thank you, I responded with a smile, making my way back to my car. Pausing, I felt tempted to ask his name, but decided against it to maintain my own anonymity. I frequented the cemetery throughout the rest of October, watching the foliage evolve into more vibrant colors. I purchased pumpkins from a roadside stand, spending an afternoon carving them into jack-o'-lanterns, which I then scattered across the cemetery. I befriended the semi-feral barn cats that came to hunt. I played in piles of leaves like a little girl, preserving my favorite ones in a scrapbook and generally doing as I pleased. One day, I examined each grave one by one, noting anything that piqued my interest. Angels and crosses were discernible on some of the headstones, but the only legible words were generic phrases. Phrases like, gone too soon, beloved wife, husband, etc. And of course, may she, he or they, rest in peace. Not a single gravestone bore a date or a name. The strangeness of it intrigued me, but I honestly didn't know what to make of it. Each time I visited the cemetery, I'd leave a few more coins by the ancestor's grave as an offering. Sometimes the man was there, but other times he'd be in or around his tent. There were times when he'd be wandering around the rest of the graveyard, and once I wasn't even sure if he was there at all. We acknowledged each other politely, but didn't speak much. We both sought solitude. While visiting a cemetery with a potentially unstable homeless man might seem reckless, I never felt threatened after our first conversation. There was only one time he took issue with my actions. This happened when I tried to enter the mausoleum. As I fiddled with the lock, hoping to break it, his cold hand suddenly gripped my shoulder from behind.
That's a private mausoleum, miss. Not open to the public.
He stated firmly.
Leave it be.
In retrospect, his physical intervention seemed a bit overboard, but at the time, I was overwhelmed with guilt for my transgression. I stuttered an apology and scampered off to examine the maintenance shed. The most interesting thing I found there was an old, non-motorized lawnmower. On my next visit, I brought him a deli sandwich, partially as an apology for my attempt at grave robbing, partially because I brought one for myself and didn't feel right eating it in front of a homeless person, but also in the hopes of getting some information out of him. He accepted it politely, but not exactly gratefully. More like it was a pack of store-brand socks from a secret Santa. He didn't seem to care what he ate or that he was underfed. He was sure he'd make it until the end of the month, and that was enough for him. "So, how long have you been here already?" I asked between bites of my Reuben sandwich.
"Since I buried my father."
He murmured. "Buried him here?" I asked in surprise.
"Wasn't enough left for a proper burial. But this is consecrated ground, so it was good enough,"
he said with a distant nod. "I'm sure you did the best you could," I assured him. His vague, cryptic answers did make me a little uneasy, but I had developed a sense of camaraderie with my fellow graveyard enthusiast and decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, at least for the moment. "So, how much do you know about this place?" "I haven't been able to find out anything about it. How old is it? Does it have a name? Why don't any of the tombstones have names or dates left?" The man just shook his head.
"All lost to time. Most of us are forgotten in less than 100 years after we pass. No sense in the stones keeping names when those names won't mean anything to anyone,"
he claimed. I just nodded and finished my sandwich. I didn't necessarily disagree with the sentiment, but it hardly explained the condition of the gravestones. I briefly entertained the thought that maybe he had chipped off all the dates and names, but quickly dismissed the notion. None of the gravestones appeared vandalized, just old. I eventually settled on the theory that the headstones had been mass-produced with the generic phrases pre-engraved and any personal information being only cheaply and shallowly carved, explaining why it had all eroded away. It wasn't a perfect theory, but it was the best I could think of. During the last week of October, there was a heavy rainstorm. When it started to lighten, I tossed on my coat and drove out to the cemetery, eager for the smell of wet leaves on the cool, damp air in my beloved sanctuary. When I arrived, I saw that the grave where I had been leaving my offerings had been dug up. Baffled, I ran from my car to the open grave without even shutting the door behind me. To my horror, I beheld the man, muddied and barely conscious, lying at the bottom of the freshly dug 4-foot hole. He had evidently decided to take advantage of the rain-softened earth to exhume the grave. But in his fragile, half-starved state, the excursion and the chill of the rain had been too much for him. Without hesitation, I jumped into the grave, grabbed him from under the armpits, and hoisted him up. "What the hell were you thinking?" I demanded as I slung his body up onto the ground.
I had to know for sure,"
he mumbled. That was the only lucid sentence I got out of him for a while. I dragged him back to his tent, cleaned him up, put him in a blanket, and got some water into him. As he recuperated, I started thinking about what exactly my obligations were. I had known that he probably wasn't mentally well, but I'd also thought he was harmless. Just a creepy loner who liked hanging out in graveyards. Like me. But clearly, whatever delusions he clung to had just caused him to nearly kill himself. If I didn't at least try to get him help, and he died, was I at fault for that? If I didn't get him help, then who would? But would his delusions even let him leave the cemetery peacefully? The thought of him being dragged out of here by cops to be locked up in some asylum was soul-crushing. There was also the more selfish concern about what would happen to the cemetery if I brought it to the attention of government officials. I had fallen so in love with it, I had seriously started considering buying a camper and squatting here myself.
"Thank you."
I was roused from my contemplation by the shameful and apologetic murmur from my tent mate. "You're lucky I came here when I did, dummy," I said, giving him a punitive slap across the knee. "Otherwise, you'd be just another nameless corpse right now. What were you trying to do? Do you even know?"
"It doesn't matter."
He shook his head. I groaned and shoved a cup of dollar store instant ramen into his hand. "Look, I can't stay here all night. Are you going to be okay by yourself?" I asked.
"Yes, miss. I'll be fine. Thank you."
He nodded. "Promise me you won't do any more digging." Or anything else that might make you keel over, I demanded.
I promise, miss.
I sighed and accepted that that would have to do.
I do have one small favor to ask, miss.
And what's that? I asked as I put my raincoat back on.
Halloween's my last night here. If it's not too much trouble, would you mind seeing me off?
Now, I of course wanted to know where the hell he thought he was going. But given his mental state, I figured it wouldn't actually do any good to ask. If Halloween was some sort of locus for his delusions, then it was probably best for him not to be alone. Well, it's not like I had any other plans. I acquiesced. Sure, I'll be here at dusk. I'll bring drinks and stuff. We'll have a little Halloween party. I always meant to go to one of those. Halloween night came. I set out a bowl of fun-sized candy bars with a please take 2 note posted to it and drove off to the cemetery. I'd brought chips, dip, whiskey, and ginger ale coolers, a sandwich platter, Halloween candy, my Bluetooth speaker, and a downloaded Halloween playlist that mostly had covers of This Is Halloween, Monster Mash, and spooky, scary skeletons. Maybe not the wildest evening, but it was literally the first party I'd ever thrown. So cut me some slack. When I pulled into the cemetery, I saw that he had placed a trash can in the center and started a bonfire and surrounded it with my jack-o'-lanterns. I was a little concerned about the safety of this and that it might attract attention, but it did look amazing, and the night was cold enough that the warmth of the blaze would make the party much more enjoyable. This looks awesome. I cried as I got out of my car and donned my kitty mask, putting out the spread on my car's hood.
All I did was put some leaves in a trash can and light a match. You're the one who took the time to carve the pumpkins,
he said humbly, perched upon a headstone and staring into the fire. Yeah, I'm a real Michelangelo with gourds, I said sarcastically, handing him a fox mask. This time, you're not leaving me hanging. Tonight, you're going to eat the food I brought and you're going to enjoy it. You're my only guest, and I will not have you spoiling the evening for everyone else.
Yes, ma'am.
He chuckled, helping himself to the sandwich platter. I pulled out my phone, hit play on my music app, and started dancing to Jonathan Young's cover of the Ghostbusters theme song. Normally, I'm pretty self-conscious at social gatherings, to the point that I avoid them as much as I can without being rude. But since the only other person there was even more reserved than I was able to cut loose a bit. I danced around the fire. I sang, I drank, I feasted, and just generally made merry. It was the most fun I'd ever had at a party. A couple of hours in, and I found myself taking a breather. I leaned against my car, engaging in aimless monologue with the man. Suddenly, a robust gust of wind sprang up, extinguishing the fire in the trash bin. The abrupt loss of flame took me aback, especially since the jack-o'-lanterns managed to stay lit. An immediate chill crept in. It was so biting that I could see my breath and frost beginning to form on the ground. The sparse candlelight revealed the man shifting from his typical melancholy. He craned his neck forward. Following his gaze, I witnessed a spectacle of pale blue flames emerging one by one. They hovered in mid-air over each grave.
Miss, stay inside the ring of jack-o'-lanterns and you'll be safe,
he advised, stepping deliberately outside the protective circle.
They don't want you anyway. Your offerings have been more than sufficient. I'm the one who owes them a debt.
Wait, what are you doing? I whispered in alarm.
I told you, tonight is my last night here.
He responded calmly. The wind stirred again, howling with the ferocity of a wild beast. Yet the spectral apparitions remained unswerving. What are those things? I asked, spinning frantically amidst the eerie siege of phantom fires.
Will-o'-the-wisps,
he said solemnly.
Spirits who've been dead so long they no longer remember their human lives and thus cannot summon human form. They appear here every All Hallows Eve, when the veil between the elder world and ours is thinnest.
You've seen these things before? I queried, bewildered by both the supernatural spectacle and his nonchalant reaction. So, they're not dangerous?
No, they are. But the jack-o'-lanterns are effective wards against them,
he assured me. The wisps had begun to move, gently bobbing towards us, heedless of the wind. "Well then get in here then. What are you doing?" I called out. He hung his head and exhaled a sigh of resignation.
"I broke my promise to you,"
he confessed.
"I finished digging up my ancestor, though I paced myself a little more this time. It was exactly what I was told it was. An immaculate corpse, incorruptible, perfectly preserved, after lying in the earth for centuries. But despite its perfect condition, I can't tell you a thing about it, not even if it was a man or a woman. That was part of the deal they made with the elder things so long ago. They traded their identity to ensure the prosperity of our family. Burying their corpse here made the cemetery hallowed to the elder things. It's why there are no names on the graves anymore. The wisps stole them, desperate for any semblance of humanity. It's why this place is so hard for most people to perceive, let alone remember."
"Listen to me. You're not thinking clearly. Those things are just oxidizing gases from the graves," I choked out, not believing my own words. "Let's just get in my car and leave, and you'll see we'll be fine."
"Do not leave that ring until they're gone,"
he commanded as the wisps drew nearer, slowly but steadily.
"I have to do this. Part of my ancestors' deal with the elder things was that each of their direct descendants would eventually sacrifice themselves as well. Every one of us who broke that pact brought ever-increasing misfortune upon us until there was just me. Thank you. I thought this place would be forgotten after I was gone. I don't know why you can see and remember it, but so long as you do, the wisps won't be able to steal its identity completely. So long as you remember me, they won't be able to steal mine. And you did make my last month just a little more pleasant. Thank you."
By now, the wisps had encircled him, spinning in a languid vortex, nipping gently at him as if testing his resolve. His breath hung thick in the air. Frost began to form on his skin and clothes, and he shivered as if in the grip of Arctic chill. He reached into his pocket and produced a keyring.
"The cemetery may not be mine, but the mausoleum is,"
he said, tossing the keys into the ring of jack-o'-lanterns.
"It's yours now, and everything inside it."
Before I could formulate a question, the wisps descended upon him en masse. He was consumed in the cold blue flames, yet he didn't burn. Instead, each wisp seemed to take a bite out of him, each piece transforming into a dark, vaporous fluid within their flames, greedily devouring him until not even a skeleton remained. I, shamefully, was not a hero that night. I screamed and cried at the sight of him being eaten alive, weeping and cowering as the wisps circled my protective ring. All I could do was pray that the jack-o'-lanterns wouldn't burn out. In the days that followed, I often questioned if I should hold a grudge against him for inviting me to watch his final moments. If he had disclosed his plan, I never would have believed him and would have insisted on being there anyway to ensure he didn't harm himself. Even in the aftermath, I wouldn't have accepted the truth if I hadn't witnessed it myself. I never would have known his fate otherwise, and am grateful he didn't have to face it alone. So perhaps it's for the best. It's hard to remain angry at the departed anyway. Once I understood the unique nature of the cemetery, I resolved to live here. I gave my landlord a month's notice, purchased a camper, solar panels, and set up near the woods in the back. I established a proper font near the entrance where I toss my spare change, hoping to placate any observing elder things. I brought a few people out there, testing the man's claim, and all they could remember was my trailer in some unfindable middle of nowhere. They couldn't even recall it being a cemetery. These days, I spend most of my free time here. Despite everything that transpired and the true nature of this place, I continue to find comfort here, and I resolved not to remove what I discovered in the mausoleum. It was filled with tomes, grimoires, genuine spell books overflowing with arcane knowledge, presumably gathered by the man's ancestor. I've been delving into them. You could say I've become something of a hedge witch, and I've planned out my first grand working. I find it unfair that the man had to give himself to the wisps due to a deal his ancestor made. I don't believe in the sins of the father or anything of the sort, I know I didn't know him for long, or that well. I still don't even know his name. But by my standards, what we shared was intimate. He was my friend, and I want to do more than just remember him. I plan to reclaim his spirit from the wisps and make him my familiar. That's why for Halloween 2019, I'll be throwing another party. This time, one wicked enough to wake the dead. So after I told you all about the strange experience I had in my little cemetery, a few of you wanted to know how my Halloween party went. Better than the last one. Thank you very much. Don't worry, I'm joking. I am going to tell you what happened. But before I do, I need to tell you more about my year in between the last two Halloweens. Otherwise, it just wouldn't make any sense. Hopefully you'll find it as interesting as I did, and I'll spread it across a few chapters to make it easier to digest. But I promise you this story does have a resolution, and we will get to it. As you already know, the night the man died, I was stuck inside a ring of jack-o'-lanterns, surrounded by formless spirits he called wisps. They couldn't pass over the circle he'd made, but they seemed to be aware of my presence. After they had devoured the man, they started orbiting around me, forming a pillar of cold blue flames that spiraled up into the night sky, until I couldn't tell them apart from the stars. If I hadn't just watched them kill my friend, it would have been beautiful. Nothing caught in their ghostly light made a shadow, and yet there were shadows. Shadows of things that weren't there, things that didn't or couldn't exist in the natural world. Even though I was hysterical, I was cognizant enough to think that the shadows were of things on the other side of the veil, where the man said the wisps were from, and that the wisps were still not fully in our world, and so their light was obstructed from the other side. At the time, I didn't know if the shadows were just horrifically distorted, or if they were accurate representations of horrifically distorted creatures. Since there was nothing I could do to fend them off anyway, I just closed my eyes and tried to wait for it to be over. That's when I realized that mixed in with the howling of the wind was an uncanny choir of ethereal voices. It was faint, and if there were any words, they weren't English, but I could tell that they weren't coming from the wisps, but from across the veil. I almost had a heart attack then, fighting my body's nearly overwhelming fight or flight response, knowing that staying put was my only chance for survival. As I listened to the voices, I came to realize that they weren't directed at me. If the things on the other side of the veil knew I was there, they didn't care. Their music was in celebration, a Halloween celebration that dwarfed mine by 1,000 orders of magnitude. A vague sort of image started to form in my mind, of a grand festival dedicated to the most sacred night of the year. In my horror, I wondered what could possibly give these ghastly beings cause for such jubilation. To my dismay, something on their side chose to answer me, in a nigh inaudible whisper that my panicked mind just barely managed to parse meaning from. All Hallows Eve marks the return of our queen, Persephone. Around midnight, the wisps and voices disappeared, and the world seemed normal again, if hopelessly dark and silent. With nothing now to light my way but the candles of the jack-o'-lanterns, I dashed to my car and sped out of the cemetery, letting all the party supplies I had placed on the hood fly off where they would. It was pitch black that night, and I was in no state to be driving, let alone as fast as I was. But I somehow made it home in one piece. I locked myself in my apartment, took a Xanax, and without getting undressed, I crawled into bed with my cat and cried myself to sleep. I took more of my Xanax than I should have over the next week, but I had no idea how else to cope with my experience. Not only had I watched someone's violent death and been put in mortal danger myself, but I'd also come into contact with some kind of spirit world, possibly the underworld of Greek mythology. I honestly think the only reason I didn't have any suicidal ideation was because that would have just taken me straight to what I was running from. It had been psychologically and existentially traumatic, and I didn't think I could tell anyone about it. No one would believe me. And if someone started snooping around the graveyard, I might be implicated in the man's death. And on top of that, I also mourned the loss of the cemetery. I loved that cemetery. It was perfect. But I told myself that it was dangerous, and that I could never go back. But almost immediately, a contradictory thought emerged that just grew louder and louder and would not be silenced. It was magic. I had to go back. And so I did. I thought it was stupid. I thought it was crazy. I thought it was infinitely stupider and crazier than when I had been going there when there was a potentially crazy homeless squatter. But goddammit, I love that cemetery. It was a week or so after Halloween. I left at dawn so that I would have as much daylight as possible. Though at the time, I wasn't even sure of what exactly I meant to do. I parked outside the cemetery instead of inside like I usually do, because that somehow made it easier for me. I stood right in front of the gates for nearly 10 minutes, I think, just trying to muster up the courage to walk back in. I stared inwards, longingly, thinking about how beautiful it was in the morning light. Those titanic trees swaying and creaking softly in the wind. The man had told me that the wisps only appeared on Halloween, when the veil was thinnest. I believed him. I had been to that place over half a dozen times before, and he had resided there for at least a month. Eventually, my curiosity overpowered my fear, and I ventured through the arch. As I stepped in, a profound sense of peace washed over me, an otherworldly tranquility. All graveyards possess this quality to some extent, but this one was more potent. I had never consciously acknowledged it before, but it had always been there, at the back of my mind. There was something else too, the veil, the barrier between our realm and others, and it was noticeably weaker in the cemetery. Once I recognized this feeling, it became apparent that the veil was much stronger now than on Halloween. My cemetery was safe. Relief washed over me, and I laughed, tears flowing freely down my cheeks. In my joy, I fell back onto the ground, making a snow angel in the leaves. I know, it sounds odd. Once I composed myself, I noticed the mess I had left behind. The sandwiches and chips had been claimed by crows, but several candy bars and cooler cans remained scattered around. I found my Bluetooth speaker too, which had surprisingly withstood the elements for a week. And then I spotted the keyring, the keys to the mausoleum, flung to me by the man as his final act, entrusted to me with his dying breath. I felt a pang of shame for forgetting them, for stumbling upon them by accident rather than purposefully seeking them out. Bending down, I gingerly picked up the keys. The man had only shown hostility once when I attempted to force my way into the mausoleum, yet he chose to pass it on to me rather than letting it sink into oblivion. What was inside that held such significance to him? I approached the mausoleum, observing it closely. It was made of solid marble, save for the copper grate windows near the top, too high for me to peek through. Above the entrance was a worn carving of a royal couple, but otherwise, it was devoid of any decoration. I unlocked and opened the iron gate first, revealing the green, copper-plated door behind. Leaning in, I listened for any signs of life. I knocked and listened again, hearing nothing. "Hello!" I shouted. "Is anyone in there?" A part of me feared that opening the mausoleum might unleash an ancient evil, but I heard nothing stirring within, so I decided to proceed. I turned the key in the lock and pulled the door open, ready to slam it shut at the slightest hint of danger. The sunlight revealed an empty mausoleum. Instead, my gaze was drawn to a large portrait on the far wall. It showcased an underground realm of sparkling limestone, misty rivers and dazzling blue auroras with wisps and humanoid figures moving across the crystalline ground. Seated on ebony thrones in the foreground were a king and queen, their glowing blue eyes matching the wisps. A three-headed dog at their feet indicated they were Hades and Persephone. Persephone held an open pomegranate in her right hand, smugly placing a seed into her lips with the left. She seemed to embrace her role as the queen of the underworld. I examined the painting for a few minutes, but my limited knowledge of fine arts didn't help determine its age. Despite its beauty, I wondered why the man hadn't sold it. Resolving to find answers, I explored the rest of the mausoleum. There was a sealed tomb in the center, draped with a purple velvet runner and a wooden chair by its side. The mausoleum also housed a dozen casket niches in the walls, but they only held candles. If this was a place to hold bodies during winter, why was there a sealed tomb in the center? And if this was the man's family mausoleum, why was his ancestor buried outside? A small bookcase under the portrait held several old books. On top was a stack of modern documents and a small safe. One of the keys opened the safe, revealing cash, jewelry, and commemorative coins. I hadn't returned to seek wealth, but knowledge. I grabbed the documents and sat down to read, hoping they'd shed light on recent events. The documents, though lacking names or dates, confirmed the man's story about his family. They were once wealthy, but a series of misfortunes had almost wiped them out. After the latest death, the man had sold off his remaining assets and returned to the cemetery. A note from a psychiatrist mentioned his growing paranoia, his belief in being haunted by vengeful spirits for betraying his family. He planned to seek sanctuary on hallowed ground, hoping to make amends with them. I knew he wasn't crazy. I had seen the wisps and heard music of the underworld. I felt truly sorry for him then, for him to have suffered through tragedy and loss his entire life, knowing that he would be next, and that the best he could hope for was to give himself to them on his own terms. I wished that he was at peace, but from what I had seen so far, I had no assurances of that. I thought about how horrible my newfound gnosis was, to know that there was an afterlife, but for that to offer no comfort and even inspire greater dread than the prospect of oblivion. For the first time in my life, to fear hell. Setting the documents aside, I turned to the bookshelf. I hoped it would offer me some kind of understanding about what I was dealing with. That's when I noticed the first book had a small sticky note attached to its spine. Miss, start here. The man's decision to leave me the mausoleum wasn't as last minute as it seemed, I guessed. I picked up the book and saw that it was a journal of some kind. I opened it, and inserted at the front was a loose leaf table of contents, written in the same hand as the sticky note. Starting with the man's recommendations, I soon realized that the journal had been written by the same ancestor who had made a deal with the elder things in the first place. They described themselves as having been born with a second sight, or clairvoyance. Among other things, it made them aware of spirits. They used this clairvoyance to bootstrap themselves to considerable wealth and social standing. Then, they used their newfound status to seek other gifted individuals and sources of occult knowledge. That's where their collection of arcane literature came from. They developed what modern scientists and philosophers would call a panpsychic theory of consciousness. Consciousness, to them, was a fundamental constituent of reality, like mass or charge. And just like those constants, consciousness did have a direct effect on reality, however minuscule. They came to the conclusion that psychic abilities were the result of being able to focus, amplify, and control these effects. For example, they believe that particles in anything that's not absolute zero are moving, but their movement is random and on the whole, they cancel each other. Telekinesis would be collapsing the wave function of an object so that all the particles move in the same direction all at once. But that's my take on it. They obviously didn't know anything about quantum physics. They also believed that consciousness became more complex within the bodies of living things, especially the nervous systems of intelligent animals. At some threshold, the organization created by these beings becomes self-sustaining, and an individual's consciousness survives the death of its original substrate. They were certain of this not only because they had seen spirits, but also because they had eventually developed astral projection, the ability to leave their own body. This led them to the discovery that there were other planes of existence besides our own, and that consciousness was not bound to any one of them. During these out-of-body experiences, they discovered a race of beings they called the Elderkin. They thought older peoples had viewed these beings as fae or gods. The man had referred to them as elder things, which I found interesting. Perhaps he just liked Lovecraft. But I'm guessing his experience with them had left him reluctant to think of them as kin. The ancestor, not content with their already considerable gifts and wealth, wanted to know what the elderkin could do for them. Now, I'm going to quote the journal directly. I have learned that if seeking a boon from the rulers of underworld, it is best to do so between the dates of Samhain and Beltane, when the queen is at court. Just as the Greek myths have said, the maiden spends half the year in the summer land with the Earth Mother. When Hades rules alone, he is not inclined towards generosity. Unlike his lecherous brothers, what warmth there is in Hades' heart is for his queen alone. When she is with her mother, he becomes cold and stern, allowing himself to feel nothing, lest he feel the pain of her absence. I have also learned not to pity Persephone. The shades of the underworld tell a different story than the one I've read. They say that, wearying of her eternal maidenhood, and with ambitions that could never be realized in her mother's shadow, it was Persephone that seduced Hades. Whereas Hades rules only because he drew the short straw with his brothers, Persephone believes it is better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven, and relishes her position as the queen of the underworld. It is to her, then, that I must make my case. If I can appeal to her sense of regal magnanimity, she may grant it, and Hades will defer to her judgment. After that, it reads like a fairly typical Faustian bargain, the man's ancestors selling their eternal soul for earthly prosperity. The only difference being that Persephone demanded their entire bloodline as the price. The ancestor was asking that their gifts pass on without fail to their descendants. I was angry when I read that they accepted this bargain. They sold not only their own soul, but that of every child, grandchild, and great-grandchild they would spawn. Because of their myopic selfishness, my friend wasn't only dead, but condemned to an abysmal afterlife for all eternity. I felt so helpless then. I thought there was nothing that I, as a mere mortal, could do to challenge the will of ancient gods. But then, I had a sudden epiphany. I was clairvoyant. Maybe I had always been and just never realized it. Maybe my time in the cemetery or my exposure to the wisps had changed me. I didn't know, and it didn't matter. All that mattered was that I could sense the veil and spirits, just like the man's ancestor could. I glanced over at the bookshelf and realized that all the knowledge the ancestor had used to hone their skills and grow their power was right in front of me. By then, it was around 5 o'clock. The sun was getting low, and I realized I hadn't consumed anything other than a bottle of water for about 10 hours. I set everything back as I found it, locked up the mausoleum, and headed back to my car. I told myself I needed food and sleep and time to process all that I had learned before committing to anything, but I knew my heart was already set. Just the day before, I wasn't sure if I would ever visit my cemetery again. Now, I was determined to follow through on my plan to move out there permanently, to be closer to the spirits and my hoard of arcane knowledge. I was going to become a witch, and maybe, just maybe, become powerful enough to right something that had gone so terribly wrong. As you've probably noticed by now, I'm typically a fairly anxious person. Living off the grid miles from town in an abandoned, haunted cemetery wasn't a decision I made lightly. I worried about everything that could possibly go wrong, even about quite a few things that couldn't actually go wrong. No matter how much I tried to talk myself out of it, I could not break my own resolve. I couldn't leave the cemetery and its secrets to rot. No matter the challenges or risks, I would make it my own. I wasn't foolhardy about it either. I did a lot of research and preparation. Before I was willing to fully commit by buying a camper trailer, I decided I needed to spend at least one full night in the cemetery. I needed to ensure I wouldn't be in any danger from the spirits that dwelt just on the other side of the weakened veil. Otherworldly things do tend to be more active at night. When the veil is a little weaker and mortals tend to be either sleepy or fearful, there had been a man squatting there for at least several weeks, but I was unsure what precautions, if any, he had taken to ensure his safety. The cemetery sits in the middle of a municipal forest called Hallowed Woods, a little under 10 miles past the city limits. It's around a mile wide by 4 miles long, with a country lane named Heroic Mile Road slicing through the center. The cemetery is a 5-acre plot of land in the middle, just to the north of the lane. With the exception of the entry arch, the The graveyard itself is almost entirely obscured by the tree line. The path leading into it is easy to overlook. Hallowed Mile isn't that heavily used, so even if it wasn't hexed, the cemetery is pretty inconspicuous. I couldn't find anything about a cemetery in Hallowed Woods online. I combed through records at the public library and town hall, and still came up empty. Ever since the man's ancestor made it hallowed ground, information about the cemetery and anything in it just faded from mortal memory. If I stayed long enough, I'd probably be forgotten too. I am at least pretty sure that the existence of the cemetery is perfectly natural. It makes sense that back in the days before motor vehicles, the local farming community would have wanted a closer graveyard than the one in town. My research wasn't entirely fruitless. Hallowed Woods has long held a reputation of being haunted. Over the past 2 centuries, there have been at least dozens of sightings and encounters with spirits and fairies. There's a legend about a horned green man that still protects the woods from development. A handful of other minor cryptids. Even one account of the Hallowed Mile becoming an infinite loop during certain times, just to name a few. Aside from the will of the wisps, I had yet to experience any of these things during my time in the cemetery. There wasn't a lot of consistency between the various alleged encounters and folklore. Yet, I did manage to find multiple incidents of hikers wandering off the trails and experiencing missing time. That's exactly what would happen if a non-clairvoyant found the cemetery and there was no one else there. They'd just forget about it. Other than that, I was thoroughly unimpressed by the hodgepodge of urban legends and campfire stories. They seemingly had nothing to do with the elderkin, wisps, or the Hadean underworld. At first, I thought I could dismiss them as apocryphal, but then it occurred to me that maybe creatures weirder than myself might be attracted to a hallowed cemetery as well. As unnerving as that thought was, I couldn't find a single confirmed instance of someone dying in the woods. There weren't supposed to be any large predators living in it either. There was even a small campground at the north end of the forest, which I remembered I had actually been to a few times as a teenager. So I decided it would be safe enough to spend the night. The cemetery was beautiful as always when I arrived. However, it was not as vibrant as it had been in October. Now the trees were all but bare. The leaves upon the ground had grown dull, and the atmosphere was overall more somber and subdued. There aren't many people aside from myself who'd consider naked trees and crumbling gravestones under a dark gray sky a cordial sight, but I'll take it over a crowded urban center in a heartbeat. I was also glad to see that the man's tent was still standing under the evergreen tree. I had never taken it down, and though I had only been in it once before, I deemed it suitable enough to spend at least one night in. I'd brought my own sleeping bag for hygienic reasons. I had arrived long before sunset and set to work sorting through the man's possessions. What little there was, I handled as respectfully as I could. Anything fit for donation, I would drop off at Goodwill. But I was somewhat taken aback to find that there wasn't a single item of food left. He really had only brought himself just enough to make it to Halloween. Aside from a meager allotment of clothes, blankets, hygiene supplies, and water testing strips, the only notable personal effect I came across was a russet brown leather wallet with a mandala embossed on the front. I opened it up and found no cash or cards, only a single pocket-sized photograph framed in the plastic window slot. In it, I saw the man standing with a slightly younger woman, holding what looked like a 2-year-old girl upon her knee. I could only assume they were his wife and daughter, and that the elder kin had likely caused their deaths just to torment him. After finding that, I had to take a moment and steady myself before I could continue. Once I bagged up all the man's old belongings and tossed them into the trunk of my car, I hauled out the fountain I'd brought to serve as a kind of donation font for the elder kin. The ancestors' journal had made it very clear that the elder kin must be shown respect and deference at all times to avoid offending them. Though I didn't realize it at the time, leaving spare change on the ancestors' grave had been a token sacrifice. It expressed my gratitude for them letting me use the cemetery. I figured that if I wanted to live there full time, I would need to show them a little bit more respect. And the fountain was a kind of down payment on that. I spent a few $100s on it, which I hoped would be a sufficient investment to ensure my well-being. It was fiberglass with a pewter finish, solar-powered with a large basin upon a 3-sided base. Each side had a relief depicting either the maiden, mother, or crone. Though I wasn't yet a practicing Wiccan, the Ancestors' Journal had alluded to Persephone being an avatar of the maiden goddess. So I thought the motif was appropriate, and if the spirits didn't like it, it would at least make a nice bird bath. Once it was filled up and running, I reverently gathered up all the coins along the grave and plunked them in, along with the spare change I had with me. I didn't know yet what I would do once it was filled up with coins, but that was a while away. While I was doing this, I noted that the purple rose I had first seen resting on the ancestor's grave all those weeks ago was still there, and it didn't appear to have wilted at all. Curiously, I picked it up to see if maybe it was plastic or some other artifice. A gentle prodding of its thorns seemed to indicate it was genuine, as did its still vibrant fragrance, as strong as if it had been freshly picked. Each time I had seen it before Halloween, I had just assumed it was a fresh, wild rose that the man picked from somewhere nearby. As weird as that was, he'd been dead for weeks at that point, so it obviously hadn't been replaced in at least that long. An undying rose in a graveyard, I smirked to myself. I brushed it off as having something to do with the ancestor and their magic. Maybe during my studies of their library, I'd learn more about it. I dug a small hole with my finger into the earth, still soft from when the man had exhumed the grave, and placed the stem so that it stood erect inside it. It still had leaves, and even an ordinary cut flower that still has leaves can be replanted. Since this rose was magic, I was fairly optimistic about its prospects. Once I'd finished my preparations for the night, I turned to my secondary purpose for the cemetery visit. I was here to hold a small memorial for the man who had once inhabited this space. To my knowledge, I was the only living soul who knew of and cared about his passing. It was a small token of respect I could offer. I leaned a memorial wreath against the ancestor's grave. Inside it, I nestled the photograph I'd found in the man's wallet. I collected 3 silver coins from the safe in the mausoleum. Without a body to place them on, I positioned them on the wreath. I hoped they could serve as a payment to the ferryman, even in this unconventional manner. As the sun began its descent, I lit a small candle inside a porcelain jack-o'-lantern holder. Kneeling by the grave, candle in my hands, I searched for the right words. I don't know if you can hear me where you are, I began. I'm still trying to grasp how all this works. It's all rather terrifying, to be completely honest. And since I'm being truthful, part of me is angry at you, blaming you for ruining my life. But even so, that part doesn't think you deserve to burn in hell forever. The time you've already spent there probably surpasses any sentence you truly deserved. But despite my ambivalence, I want to thank you for your actions, for leaving me the keys to the mausoleum, for indexing your ancestors' journal, all of it. Without your guidance, I would have been adrift in confusion. Now, I at least have a semblance of understanding, an inkling of what transpired. Despite the horrifying truth, I still believe that knowledge trumps ignorance. So regardless of what happens to me, or to my sanity, thank you for sharing your knowledge with me. How I wish I knew your name. How I wish I had shared mine with you. I'm sorry I never properly introduced myself. When we first met, caution seemed justified. But after that, despite your eccentricities, you became my friend. I want to say better late than never, but the truth is, I have no idea if that's the case. But just in case it is, my name is Samantha. Samantha Sumner. If you can hear me, know that I've appointed myself the caretaker of this cemetery. I've always loved this place, its beauty, its peace. Barring that one incident, of course. It's sacred to the elder kin, a weak point in the veil, a storehouse of arcane knowledge. I can't let that be lost. I plan on spending as much time here as possible to guard it, to understand it. I can't predict whether this will work out, but I'm willing to try. The assets you left in the mausoleum won't go to waste. They'll be dedicated to maintaining this place, which I believe aligns with your wishes. I don't have a pressing need for money. I've always been an impoverished member of the bourgeoisie. When I was a child, my parents bought mutual funds for me, filled them with savings and inheritance until I turned 18. If need be, I could survive solely on those. What truly excites me, however, are the books. I plan on learning everything your ancestor knew about spirits and the otherworld, to refine my own clairvoyance into full-blown witchcraft. And, if I'm lucky, if we're both lucky, I might even find a way to help you. Maybe that's a pipe dream. You and your ancestors had access to those books for generations, yet you couldn't escape the deal with Persephone. Right now, I barely have a clue about what I could do, yet I am still determined to try. I believe that covers everything I wanted to share with you. Thank you for everything. Remember that I'm here to remember you, to care for the cemetery, and I'll keep an eye out for anything that might make your eternity a bit less tormenting. For now, I've left you some pennies for the ferryman, just in case the passage to hell has a toll. I also have some libations. It's a horse-stage cognac, a favorite of my father's. We used to drink it together on our visits. Cheers. I held up the bottle in a toast, took a sip, and then poured the rest on the ground for my friend. Once empty, I replaced the cap and propped the bottle against the grave. May these spirits lift your spirits, my friend. By the time I finished speaking, the sun had set, and it was barely past 5. With 5 or 6 hours to kill before sleep, I was left alone in the darkness. This is likely why people rarely camp out in late November. I brought a powerful flashlight for emergencies, but I didn't intend on wandering around the cemetery in the dark. Instead, I started a fire and settled into a canvas folding chair, planning not to move until bedtime, barring any natural calls. I passed the time reading, listening to downloaded music on my phone and enjoying my dinner. Quite often, I simply sat quietly, tuning into the world around me. A winter silence had already settled in, seductively soothing. Cold-blooded creatures had either perished, migrated, or hibernated, leaving only owls and coyotes to serenade the night. Naturally, I was still somewhat on edge from the Halloween experience and kept my senses attuned to any signs of spectral activity. Yet I saw no ghosts or wisps, heard no ethereal voices. While the veil was slightly weaker than during the day, it was nowhere near as frail as it had been on All Hallows' Eve. As the hours ticked by, my anxiety waned, replaced by a complacency with my surroundings. I was no longer worried about otherworldly threats, and mundane threats seemed almost laughable. Trespassers were unlikely to be a concern either. It was highly probable that I was the only person around for miles. And even if I wasn't, the unique nature of the cemetery served as a shield against unwanted intruders. Ironically, the place that had initially incited so much anxiety in me now seemed to be the most tranquil refuge. I reveled in my solitude, tilting my head back to take in the rural night sky. The clouds had cleared, revealing a magnificent, unspoiled view of the cosmos. Countless stars sparkled brilliantly against the dark canvas of the night. I could even discern the Milky Way, a sight I hadn't witnessed in years. If I chose to live in the cemetery, I realized, I'd be able to behold this spectacle every clear night. This is going to be great, I smiled, reassured in my decision to make this my new home. When I finally retired to the tent for the night, I fell asleep surprisingly easily. Despite being fully dressed in outerwear and having only a thin layer of nylon as shelter, I was not perturbed. I've read that your brain never fully switches off during your first night in a strange location. But that night, I slept deeply. It was all the proof I needed to believe that even my subconscious saw the cemetery as home. My dreams, however, were not familiar. Every night, I've slept in my cemetery since. I have experienced vivid, mystic dreams, dreams that I often struggle to interpret. I've come to realize that when I sleep, when my mind is quiet and devoid of earthly stimuli, it is more open to spiritual revelations from across the weakened veil. That first night, I dreamed of my cemetery when it was young. It was a bright summer day in a time long past. The graves were not only pristine, they still had names upon them. Names that, upon waking, I was unable to recall. I saw a figure standing in the entry arch, their body completely shrouded in an impenetrable black fog. No identifying feature was exposed. They stood right in the middle, with arms outstretched and their head craned towards the sky. They began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. Without changing their stance, they slowly marched forward. Behind them followed a procession of astral beings. They issued from the now hexed archway. Incorporeal, skeletal things, made a faint shadow and wrapped in thin cloaks of darkness. They bobbed along the ground as if gravity were a mere suggestion to them. All of them had bowed heads and bent backs. Each carried themselves with a trodden stance and hopeless grimace. All marched forward simply because they had long ago lost the will to resist. As the shadow wraith and its melancholy slaves advanced, day was turned to night and summer to winter. Life, light, and hope retreated from their path. The names on the headstones evaporated into the night, forever lost to the void. When the grim trope reached the opposite end of the cemetery, it was entirely cast in a dismal winter darkness. They stood before a second archway, identical to the first. When the shadow wraith stepped foot under it, it seemed that the ritual was complete. The slaves, released from their duty, collapsed to the ground. They wept and screamed and moaned as they disintegrated into dust. A ring of bright blue, deathly cold flames encircled the cemetery, forming a perimeter with the two archways as its terminals. Thunder cracked and a palpable darkness, deeper than any earthly night, enveloped the cemetery. It was pelted in a rain of black ichor from some cursed titan. I could feel everything slowly sinking away from the mortal plane and into the underworld. The shadow wraith moved towards the middle of the cemetery now to inspect its work. The cemetery would forever be of two worlds, with the front gate for mortals and the back gate for spirits. With both of them now at an equal distance from the wraith, the question remained, which world did it desire most? I awoke then in the early morning, well rested, but with the strange and unexpected dream still at the forefront of my mind. Had any of that really happened? Not necessarily literally, but was there any kernel of truth to it? There was one way to find out. I leaped out of the tent and raced to the far end of the cemetery, skidding to a stop before I reached the woods. I saw it. Just behind the tree line, there was a second archway. I hadn't seen it before because the foliage had been too thick, but now the naked trees left it plainly exposed. It seemed that the cemetery had originally been a bit longer, and that the tree line had encroached inwards over the centuries. I stood there dumbfounded for a moment. The revelation from my dream was clearly manifested in the waking world. I didn't doubt that it was a portal to the underworld. Even in those early days, my clairvoyance was keen enough to sense its ominous astral properties. I took slow, cautious strides towards it, fearful that Cerberus himself would come charging to keep me out. The archway looked so mundane, exactly like the one out front. But its intrinsic chthonic nature bore down on my soul like a freight train. The closer I got, the more I had to fight my instinct to recoil. When I was right in front of it, I tentatively raised my arm. "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," I muttered before shoving my arm through the archway. Nothing happened. It was a portal for spirits after all. The dream had been quite clear about that. I could walk under it, all I wanted, and nothing would happen as long as my soul was firmly bound to my body. If I ever wanted to use it, I'd have to be dead. Or, like the man's ancestor had, learn how to astral project. I was a little crestfallen at this new revelation, to be honest. I had proven to myself that I could spend the night in the cemetery with no ill effect, though not without effect entirely. I had learned more about the nature of the cemetery and discovered a means by which I may aid my hellbound friend. But the reality of the task was daunting. I ruled that nothing needed to be decided right away, and that I should go to the somber Starlight Roadhouse up the highway and get a hot breakfast. I didn't have much faith in myself at that moment. Even if I could learn to astral project, I doubted if I'd ever have the courage to make an Orphean trek to the underworld by myself. But I wouldn't have to. Just a few months later, I would meet Genevieve, a gifted witch, learned occultist, and the love of my life. The following months unfolded without significant incident. I acquired a camper trailer, established my home in the cemetery, and experienced no unsettling brushes with the supernatural. In the mausoleum, I perused every book, diligently recording observations in my personal book of shadows, assuming the role of a bona fide witch. My dreams, my soul portal into the astral plane, were also chronicled there. By the tail end of March, I had failed to achieve astral projection, and a sense of apprehension was creeping in. If by May Day I couldn't master it, I'd have to wait until the subsequent Halloween for a chance to plea with Persephone to liberate my friend. This meant another half a year in literal hell. Despite the burden of this realization, my visit to downtown was not prompted by a desire to seek guidance from another witch in honing the craft. I was merely there to procure seeds for a garden I intended to cultivate once the climate grew warmer. However, as I was navigating Queen Street, a structure situated just off Albion Avenue captured my attention. A charming Victorian edifice. Its ground floor had been transformed into a storefront. Eve's Eden of Esoterica. Spiritual Wellness and Metaphysical Supply Center read the sign. A new age shop I had noticed in the past, but never deeply contemplated. Post-Halloween encounter. I had never imagined that commercialized mysticism could offer genuine solutions to my predicaments. Yet, as I found myself staring at the building, an undeniable premonition prickled within me. My clairvoyance suggested that something authentically paranormal resided within that shop. Even if my intuition was flawed, a look inside couldn't cause harm. I parked along the avenue and approached the entrance, where an array of flyers publicizing the shop's offerings greeted me. Crystals, candles, incense, books, divination cards, Ouija boards, spell kits, altar idols, holistic medicine, herbal teas, and a plethora of related paraphernalia. Regularly, they hosted yoga and meditation sessions, provided individualized metaphysical consultations, and once a month, organized women-led sacred sexuality seminars. Indeed, the establishment embodied virtually every New Age cliché I could conceive, and I might have chuckled had it not been for the hand-drawn logo adorning the front door. It depicted a blonde, biblical Eve, but her forbidden fruit was a pomegranate, not an apple. Her confidently smiling lips held a seed, mirroring the portrait of Persephone in the mausoleum. Yes, refashioning an old story of subjugation into a feminist portrayal of empowerment wasn't innovative, but the striking similarities to the Persephone illustration were eerie. Whoever crafted that drawing surely held some knowledge of the underworld, and I needed to converse with them. Entering the shop, an old-fashioned bell announced my arrival, and I immediately spotted what my senses had detected from the outside. A stunning young woman was seated behind the front desk, engrossed in a book. Tall and slender, her long, ashy blonde hair cascaded down her back. Her intense blue eyes accentuated with smoky eyeshadow. High cheekbones, a delicate nose, and chin graced her face. Her fair skin adorned with vibrant nature inspired in pagan tattoos. She bore a striking resemblance to the Eve from the logo, albeit in more attire. She was clad in a dark green, hooded, crocheted vest, held closed only by a drawstring at the chest, exposing her flat stomach and a pierced navel, paired with khaki shorts. Her aura, though, was even more remarkable than her appearance. I easily sensed that she was a powerful clairvoyant like myself, far more potent than any other individual I had come across since delving into the occult. She could potentially offer me some guidance in navigating this unfamiliar arcane world I had inadvertently stumbled upon. Yet, as is characteristic of my socially anxious self, I simply stood, dumbfounded and staring at her, too petrified to utter a simple greeting. After a moment of silence, she raised her gaze from her book, and a customary retail smile quickly morphed into an expression of genuine surprise and delight.
"Hello, sister."
She beamed, standing and extending her right arm. Initially, I involuntarily recoiled from her attempt at instigating familiarity, but then understood that she could read me as effortlessly as I could her. If our shared witchery did not forge a kinship, then what could? Hello, sister, I responded, nervously accepting her handshake and deflecting my gaze as much as possible. Although she was only marginally taller, I felt wholly dwarfed by her presence. "Ah, you're Eve then, I take it."
"Genevieve, yes. Genevieve Fawn. Eve or Evie works fine, though."
She clarified. "Wow. Genevieve Fawn. That's such a beautifully witchy name," I gushed. "I'm, Samantha Sumner, and I do prefer Samantha in full."
"Samantha it is,"
she replied, her smile unwavering.
"It's a rare pleasure to meet another gifted woman, especially a lovely redhead like yourself. How is it that we've never crossed paths before? Are you new to Sombermory?"
"Oh, no. I've lived here all my life," I responded. "But I only recently became aware of my clairvoyance. Last Halloween, I had a pretty intense encounter with the supernatural, and since then I've been studying it intently. I'm concerned that I've come as far as I can on my own, though, and I felt your aura from outside. I was hoping you might be able to help me hone my abilities. I'm especially interested in learning how to astral project."
"I would love to take you on as an initiate,"
she declared, her eyes gleaming.
"Do you have some time now, actually? We can go into the parlor and talk over some wine or weed if you like. I have plenty of both."
Big yes on the wine. Merlot if you have it. I always need a little social lubricant to open up to new people. I nodded, relieved that I wouldn't have to fight against my social anxiety just to talk to her. "I'll only smoke if you have a CBD dominant strain. Anything more than 15% THC tends to turn my anxiety into full-blown paranoia."
"I've got some sativa that should work for you. Please take a seat. I'll be with you in a moment."
I did as she asked, sitting in the parlor while she flipped the open sign on the door to closed. She fetched a bottle of Merlot, wine glasses, and an adorable little mini bong with a pentagram on one side and a triple moon goddess sigil on the other. She poured the wine first, and I sipped mine as she readied the bong.
"There, take a little hit off of that and tell me if it's too much for you."
Passing it to me, I nodded appreciatively as I took a small hit to test it, swirling the smoke in my mouth a bit before inhaling into my lungs, then blowing it back out. "That's perfect. Thank you," I said, taking a bigger hit before passing it back to her.
"No problem,"
she said as she took a hit herself.
"So, how about you start by telling me about this encounter you had on Halloween?"
And I did. I get pretty talkative when I have something in me to calm my nerves, so I spent more than an hour telling her everything that I'd been through since October. She sat there listening with rapt interest, rarely interrupting. I let out an exhausted sigh when I finally finished and went to drain the rest of my wine.
"Wow,"
she murmured.
"You really had to watch him die?"
"Yeah, it was probably the worst thing that's ever happened to me," I admitted. "And when I say that, it sounds like I must be pretty damn stupid to be living there now."
"I don't think you're stupid, Samantha. I think you're incredibly resilient to have not let one traumatic experience ruin a place that clearly means a lot to you,"
she countered earnestly.
"I mean, I love this house, but if something like that happened here, I don't know if I'd be strong enough to stay. You're a remarkable woman, Samantha."
I nodded half-heartedly, utterly unconvinced of that. The picture on your front door of Eve, it looks almost exactly like the portrait of Persephone in my mausoleum. I finally managed to bring up. When I saw that, I thought that it couldn't be a coincidence. You've spoken with spirits yourself, haven't you?
"I have, including ones that have claimed to have visited both the underworld and Summerland."
She nodded.
"I also have visions on occasion. I've seen the maiden goddess ruling as queen of the underworld. and the spirits confirmed this for me. It makes sense, truthfully. The maiden embodies all aspects of women's youth, including the need for independence from our mothers and to forge our own identities apart from them. The myth of Persephone is much more palpable to me in that light. She's a woman of extremely assertive agency, and bastardizations of the myth that reduce her to something pretty for Hades and Demeter to fight over were only meant to take that agency from her.
I see. Everything I've read about her in the Ancestors' Journal so far has made it very clear that she does not want for power, I agreed. Though, considering what I'm planning on doing, that's a little more intimidating than inspiring.
And you are sure that's what you want to do? Journey to the underworld to petition Persephone, to pardon a man you barely knew?
I nodded somberly, not really expecting her to understand. I knew him well enough to consider him a friend, and my interactions with him, brief though they were, ended up changing my entire life trajectory and worldview. He had a significant impact on my life, and it troubles me deeply that he suffered, died, and is now trapped in Hades for all eternity because of a deal made well over a century before he was even born. I figure if a mortal convinced Persephone to do this, a mortal can convince her to undo it, and no one else is going to argue for my friend's freedom but me. This is something I have to do, not just for him, but for me, because I can't justify abandoning one of the few people I felt a connection with when they need me the most. Genevieve smiled, anxiously biting her knuckle.
I really admire your conviction, even if I don't completely understand it. I'm more than willing to help you. Tell me about your attempts to astral project so far.
I start by meditating for at least 20 minutes. Then once I'm fairly relaxed, I visualize a glowing astral body rising up from my physical body, over and over until I actually start to feel myself floating, and the vibrations of the astral plane, I explained. And then I always chicken out.
That's perfectly understandable. Your technique sounds good, though, and I think that just having a guide with you could help you finally cross that threshold. Entheogens are also helpful, both for calming the mind and enhancing your clairvoyance. I microdose on mushrooms and have a special strain of cannabis called Delphi Dream to help get into the right headspace. Binaural music and soothing incense are good too, of course.
I'm willing to try all of that. I nodded eagerly. We can do all that here in your meditation studio?
We could, but I think it would be best to do it in your cemetery. It's familiar to you, where you're comfortable and close to the underworld portal. You're also used to trying with a weakened veil. I'd also like to see this place for myself. It's amazing to think that I've been so close to an astral nexus all these years and had no idea, though I guess they're not supposed to be easy to find.
She halted when she noticed I was staring at her. You called it a cemetery. I smiled softly.
Isn't that what you said it was?
She asked, confused. I did, but no one else I've ever told about it has been able to remember that for more than a moment, I explained. I've even had my parents out there, and they can't remember it's a cemetery. I brought my hand to my mouth, trying to stifle tears. I'm sorry. This whole thing has been weighing on me more than I've realized, and it's such a relief to finally be able to really talk about it to somebody, and I'm so sorry to burden you with all of this. I trailed off into sobs, and Genevieve placed her arm around me consolingly.
Samantha, you're not burdening me with anything. I've been practicing astral projection for years, but I've never been able to leave the physical plane. For years I've been searching for a way to visit the underworld or Summerland and see my goddess in person, and then you walk through my front door and tell me you've been living in an astral nexus for the past 4 months. Meeting you has been the best thing to happen to me in a very long time.
Same, I murmured meekly. God, I'm sorry. I'm not great at this. And by this I meant whatever you mean or meant. Or, I don't want to misread you, because I do that sometimes and make things awkward. But if I pretend not to notice and I wasn't misreading you, then you might get offended and things still get awkward. And
Samantha.
She interrupted as politely as anyone possibly could. gently sweeping back my hair.
Would you like to spend the night with me?
I hesitated for just a moment. I'd never slept with someone I had just met before, and I didn't really think of myself as the kind of person who did that. But she was the only other witch I had ever met, the only person who could help me and I could confide in, the only kindred spirit who could truly understand what I was going through. And she was so beautiful. I leaned in and kissed her, and I'm not actually penning an erotica here, so those are all the sexy details you're going to get about that. Sorry. I will share an unsexy detail with you, though. I cried again at one point. I hadn't had physical relations for a few years, and I guess I was in denial about how starved for affection I was. It's just that all of my previous relationships, with women or men, had never really amounted to much, and I had just accepted that I didn't pair well with anyone. But Evie and I, we just clicked. I was smitten. In the morning, she made me breakfast with plant protein eggs and soy bacon. And even though I had never really been able to get into vegan food before, just the fact that she cooked them for me made them wonderful. We packed up everything we would need, and once her shop girl was in, we set off for the cemetery. It was a beautiful, early spring morning, just above freezing. Crisp, clean air filled with the singing of the newly returned birds. Lingering patches of snow and creeks and ditches flowing freely with the winter runoff.
I don't get out of the city as much as I should,
Genevieve remarked as we drove down Heroic Mile Road, admiring the majestic forest around us.
I do most of my outdoor rituals in Euphemia Park, but these woods, they have a primeval, nearly pristine feel to them, like the horned god still runs wild in them, a remnant of the once great forest our ancestors destroyed. It's sublime. Why are you slowing down?
The cemetery's just up ahead, I said, pointing right. Do you see it? Look just past the tree line. She leaned forward and squinted, but shook her head.
I just see trees. Maybe a bit sparser here than before, but that's all I notice,
she replied, sounding a little disappointed. I turned onto the looped path, and as soon as we passed under the arch, her face lit up in wonder. You feel it, right? Of course you do, I smiled.
I've never been anywhere the veil was this thin before,
she gasped.
This really is an astral nexus, a conduit between the astral and physical planes, sacred to the great goddess. And I couldn't see it. Does that mean I'm not worthy to be here?
Absolutely not, I said resolutely. I wasn't sure if clairvoyance was all that was required or if there was something more. But even if there is, it's not about worthiness. I'm sure of that. The occultist that made this place sure as hell wasn't worthy. Honestly, I think it was just my fascination with cemeteries combined with my latent clairvoyance that let me see this place. I'm not special, just weird. I brought the car to a stop right in front of my trailer. And this has been my house for the past 4 months, I said. I know it's not even a tenth the size of your beautiful home, but I find the ample yard space more than makes up for it.
Oh my God, it's a tiny house. You have a tiny house. I love it.
She screamed, leaping out of the car and excitedly running laps around my trailer.
Is it completely solar powered?
Yep. I've got 5 275-watt panels all up on my roof and 12 kilowatt hours of power storage, I explained, as I got out of the car and shut both our doors. I hooked up an electric pump to the well for water, which I did have tested, and I keep a rain barrel for backup.
What about your sewage?
I use a compost toilet, so I don't have any black water, and all my soap is biodegradable, so my gray water is safe to just dump. I'm also going to plant a vegetable garden soon, and I'm going to build some cold frames and maybe even a small greenhouse so that I can garden next winter. I'm really trying to embrace a homesteading lifestyle and become as self-sufficient as possible.
You are amazing. Look at this thing. You closed in your awning with a mesh net so you have an outdoor room and... is that a hot tub?
Just a little one. There's no room for a tub in the trailer, and I like to take baths.
You did not do this place justice when you described it to me,
she claimed.
This isn't squatting. This is glamping. You are the most glamorous hedge witch in the history of hedge witches.
She was the first person to ever call me a hedge witch. I liked it. Go get set up. I have to feed my cat before we start. I'll be with you in a minute, I instructed. When I stepped into my trailer, I was greeted by the irritated meowing of my tabby. Moxley. I know. I didn't come back last night and you're hungry. I'm so sorry. I apologized as I set to work filling up a bowl of food. I have a good excuse, though. I met someone wonderful, someone kind and magic and smart and beautiful and very, very good with her fingers. I placed the bowl in front of him and gently scratched his head as he gobbled it up. She's going to help me with my astral projection today. I'm really excited about it. Though we could be doing almost anything together, and I'd be really excited about it. Can I tell you a secret, Moxley? I'm already hoping she's going to be your new mommy. I know I said I didn't want other people out here, but I think she might deserve an exemption. You can meet her in a little bit, but right now we've got important witch stuff to do. I'll be back later. I kissed him on the head and went out to join Genevieve in the cemetery. She was already sitting in the lotus position on the blanket she'd brought. The incense had been burned. Her music was playing on my Bluetooth speaker, and she was once again preparing her bong.
Has that microdose hit you yet?
I think so. Colors are more saturated, and all my senses, including my clairvoyance, feel sharper, I replied.
Good. Entheogens really do make all the difference for first-timers. The Delphi dream will definitely make it easier to astral project, but it's right at your limit for THC.
She cautioned.
Do you want to try it?
Yes, I think it will be okay. I feel pretty safe here. And with you, I said shyly, sitting down across from her. She smiled and passed me the bong. I took a few small hits off it, and it was definitely unusual. I felt the usual calmness and euphoria I would have expected from a hybrid strain, but there was no risk of stray anxious thoughts snowballing into a panic attack. I was instead shifted into an altered state of consciousness, where my thinking was much more intuitive than my usual anxious overanalyzing. My thoughts flowed like water, and I merely watched as a detached observer. This, combined with the fact that my clairvoyance was now noticeably stronger, making it almost effortless to focus on spiritual manners. Lulled by the music and Genevieve's guiding voice, I soon entered a deep state of meditation. At Genevieve's instruction, I envisioned my astral body rising upwards. I felt myself levitating almost immediately, along with the higher frequency vibrations of the astral plane. This time, though, I felt no fear, and I didn't stop. I just allowed it to happen.
Samantha, open your eyes,
I heard Genevieve say. I obediently complied, and to my amazement, saw her literally radiant form floating proudly in the air. She was now as nude as the image on her shop's logo, her flowing hair draped over her chest and a soft light emanating from her womanhood, simultaneously obscuring it while framing it as something profoundly sacred. In shock, I looked down at myself to see my glowing form hovering over my physical body. To my relief, I wasn't nude, but dressed in an approximation of what my real body was wearing. Jeans, a red hoodie, and green thermal vest. Presumably because that's what I'd been imagining. I could still feel my body. I wasn't free of it, just projecting my consciousness outwards. Since my real eyes were closed, I could only see with my clairvoyance. The physical world now seemed dark and ghostly, seen through a fog and heard underwater. Only astral bodies, like myself and Genevieve, appeared bright and distinct and fully real. Thank you, I whispered softly, too stunned by my success to be excited by it.
Congratulations, Samantha. You are now officially an astral projector.
She cheered.
Do you want to just fly around for a bit? It's fine if you do. That's what most people do their first time. It's really cool.
No. I shook my head vigorously. I've been trying to do this for months. I can't waste this opportunity. I need to seek an audience with Persephone. I turned my attention towards the rear archway, the astral portal to the underworld, and I was effortlessly whisked towards it. On the astral plane, it bore little resemblance to its physical form. It was instead a colossal structure of carved onyx, its pillars made of miserable skeletal figures, eyes glowing and mouths agape, crushed beneath the weight of Hades and Persephone on their thrones. The portal itself was occluded with thick white fog, but it emanated a devastating sense of dread and despair, and I could hear the distant, anguished wails of the dead on the other side. And it was cold, a coldness that represented a dearth of energy and life. "You, might want to put on something warmer," I said half-jokingly. She grabbed my hand, and an invigorating warmth spread from her astral form and into mine.
These aren't our physical bodies, and that's not physical cold. We need astral energy to keep us warm, and I have plenty of that,
she assured me.
Remember that we can't get trapped down there. We're still bound to our bodies, and all we have to do to end this is open our eyes. The only way to be separated from your body without dying is to achieve complete detachment from earthly desires. And I love weed, wine, and women too much to be in any danger of that. Funny that that's what's going to keep me out of hell.
She paused, noticing that I was staring up in utter horror at the idols of the gods who had turned my life upside down, whose domain I now dared to trespass in.
Samantha, I won't think any less of you if you don't want to do this,
she promised. I shook my head, tears flowing down my cheeks. I can't give up now, I said adamantly, more to myself than to her. If we get separated, we'll both wake up immediately. Agreed?
Agreed.
She nodded.
Whenever you're ready, sister.
I tightened my grip upon her hand, its warmth consoling me, reminding me that I wasn't walking into Hades alone, as I had thought I would, that I had the support and guidance of a wise and powerful witch, that I wasn't just some lone recluse daring to meddle in matters beyond her ken. With her by my side, I could do this. I inhaled deeply of the astral ether, and, shoving all fear and doubt from my mind, Genevieve and I stepped through the portal to the underworld. As the mists parted, our astral forms stepped through the other side of the portal. Genevieve and I beheld the grim and macabre spectacle that was the underworld. The portrait in the mausoleum didn't do it justice. It was an abysmal, cavernous realm stretching far overhead. As far as I could see, the horizon arched upwards like the reflection of a funhouse mirror, or a 360-degree panorama shot. All of the speleothems, the cave formations, were monstrous in both size and shape, twisted into grotesque and appalling configurations that would be impossible under earthly physics. They were non-Euclidean in the purely Lovecraftian sense of the word. The dark limestone glittered faintly under the pale, eerie blue light that bathed the entire hellscape, emanating from a ghostly aurora that danced high above us. A damp, gloomy fog crept along the ground. Thin, spidery clouds lazily drifted overhead in a spiraling vortex, continuously casting mutating shadows. Numerous, craggy, and yawning chasms glowed with a faint blue flame as well, looking like they would swallow up anyone or anything that might dare to get too close. But the horror of the landscape itself was nothing compared to that of the shades. The souls condemned to call that place home for all eternity. The ones that listlessly shambled upon the ground were still roughly human, but they were all in some state of degradation. Some looked recently deceased. Most were mere skeletal wraiths of their former selves. A few were just vaguely humanoid silhouettes that no longer bore any lingering semblance to a specific person. Worst of all were the wisps. They couldn't even really be said to possess a distinct form at all anymore. Just amorphous orbs of blue light hanging buoyantly in the dank ether. So ancient were they that they'd lost all memories of being human. They were so desperate to experience any trace of what they once were. They would steal biographical memories and knowledge from the living world any chance they got. But all the shades, no matter their shape, groaned and wailed and screamed, the voices forming a melancholy cacophony upon the cold and howling wind. My knees gave out beneath me. I would have fallen had Genevieve not been there to catch me. This is hell, I wept softly. The concept was still hard for me to accept, wanting so desperately for it not to be true. This is where people are left to idle and rot, bitterly reminiscing of the lives they once had, over and over again as those memories fade beyond recognition, until they lose any sense of what they once were and decay into undifferentiated wisps of themselves, stripped of their identity to merely exist without any sense of self until the end of time. That's what will happen to my friend if I don't get him out. Genevieve held me in her arms, staring out at the Thana kingdom with a look of disillusion in her eyes.
This can't be the maiden's goddess realm,
she murmured.
These souls, they're suffering. The goddess is compassionate. She wouldn't allow this.
Even if the maiden and mother are just different avatars of the same goddess. Persephone is not her mother. The ancestors' journal made that very clear, I muttered. Forcing myself to my feet, I reminded myself of why I had come to this most wretched of places. The wisps aren't attacking us, at least. The journal said they can't steal identities from astral projections, but it's nice to know for sure now. I thought back to my friend's words. You know, almost the last thing my friend said to me was that so long as I remembered him, the wisps wouldn't be able to steal his identity. Even when your soul's actually down here, just having living people keep you in their minds is enough to keep you from fading away. We stood in silence for a moment, taking in the ghastly scene before us. We tried not to be overwhelmed with existential dread.
So, the plan's still to petition Persephone for a pardon?
Genevieve asked at last. I thought for a moment, briefly considering the possibility of searching for my friend and just taking him back ourselves. I was pretty sure it didn't work like that, though. And even if it did, the vast horde of the dead before us assured me that the task would be impossible anyway. The dead outnumbered the living, after all. It is, I finally replied.
Okay, so, any idea on how to go about finding her?
The plan is for her, or rather her minions, to find us, I replied. The journal said that trespassers in the underworld don't go unnoticed for very long. Let's just press forward for now and see what happens. Still hand in hand, Genevieve and I began our trek through the land of the dead. The shades didn't pay us much mind, at most sparing us a sideways glance before returning to their lethargic shuffling and woeful ruminations. I wondered if I knew any of them, or if any of them were people I might have heard of. I pondered what they could have possibly have done in life to deserve such a miserable fate, and what, if anything, I could do to avoid it myself.
Samantha, look,
Genevieve whispered, pointing towards the ground. Luminescent white flowers of dazzling crystal were poking through the cracks. Droplets of ambient mist crowned them in a soft halo. Letting go of my hand, Genevieve knelt to the ground and scooped one up.
It's warm,
she said, an amazed smile spreading across her face.
Warm and bright like nothing else here. I think we're in the Asphodel Meadows, and these flowers are Persephone's work. They have to be. A glimmer of the summerland in the underworld, just like her.
An ear-splitting screech pierced the sky above, and we immediately spun our heads towards its source. 3 dark, winged forms descended upon us, boxing us in. Even in the gloomy underworld, they were dark. Women-shaped voids speckled in starlight, hair and wings and tails of smoke, with talons in place of fingers and toes, eyes of faint stardust glowing dully in their hollow sockets. They were the Erinyes, the Furies, daughters of the primeval night. I had been expecting them. Genevieve dropped the flower and we clung to each other like frightened children. The 3 infernal goddesses all cackled at our cowardice.
Welcome, ladies. Welcome to the realm invisible. Always a delight to receive astral travelers, especially blessed ones like yourselves.
The first one said. She stepped towards us, glaring down at us with a ravenous gaze. She lifted a tress of Genevieve's hair in her talons, taking a deep, covetous sniff.
We don't get souls like yours down here often. You've come here on a quest of some kind, I take it.
She tilted Genevieve's head up towards her with her sharp talon, only for her to bat it away. The Furies cackled again, but made no move to discipline us. Yes, I have, I spoke up, trying my hardest not to seem intimidated. A friend of mine was taken here because of a deal an ancestor of his made with Persephone, and not through any fault of his own. He doesn't deserve to be here. I would like to plead with Persephone for an appeal. Please. The Fury chuckled softly, and for a moment I was terrified she was going to tell me to leave.
No need to be so formal, my dear. All trespassers get an audience with our Lord and Lady, whether they want it or not.
Without warning, she grabbed us both by the shoulder, her talons digging deep into our astral forms. We screamed first in pain and then terror as she took flight, lifting us high into the ether and across the realm of the dead. We flew over all 7 of the underworld's misty rivers, each of them choked with waiting shades that only parted for Charon when his fairy physically pushed them aside. As we flew deeper and deeper into the underworld, the ambient sound of forlorn weeping and gnashing of teeth was gradually replaced by something I can only describe as a clamor or ruckus. I craned my neck towards the sound and beheld Pandemonium, the city of Dis, capital of Hades. From so high above, it was easy to see that the city was laid out in a Metatron pattern of 13 circles. One in the center, surrounded by 2 layers of 6 circles each. The structures within the city were a grossly exaggerated caricature of Gothic architecture. And just like the Speleothems, they were impossibly twisted constructs that would never have been allowed to stand under earthly laws. There were still some shades amongst the city's denizens, though they appeared more lucid and willful than the ones outside the city walls. But the majority of the inhabitants were the elder kin that had been described to me in the ancestors' journal. Some were shaped like women, like the Furies. Some were shaped like men, like the Chthonic judges. But most were shaped like nothing living at all. No mortal creature could survive with bodies like the ones I saw. And so I had no doubt that these things had never been living at all, but were natives to the astral plane. Gods or fae, angels or demons, the names hardly matter. Their bodies were all spikes and horns and strange orifices, elongated and stunted limbs, scales and slime, every deformity and mutation imaginable, and most of all, just plain wrong. Their ethereal movements and puckish chattering confirmed my suspicions. These were the creatures whose shadows I had seen and voices I heard on Halloween. It was these monsters who had celebrated the return of their queen so fervently. The palace of Hades loomed as a jet-black obsidian monstrosity. It perched upon an enormous rock floating above the dead center of the city, held in place by 7 colossal chains. An avalanche of fog perpetually rolled off its edges. The Furies flew us directly into the throne room. There, they cast us carelessly upon the gleaming floor.
Cold Hades, dread Persephone, pardon the intrusion, but we found a pair of astral travelers who'd like an audience with you.
The lead Fury announced. There they were, seated in a pair of ostentatious black thrones upon a hovering obsidian dais, Hades and Persephone. Both appeared mostly as they had in the portrait, fair skin, dark-robed, white-haired. Their eyes burned with the same blue glow that saturated the entire underworld. Hades was lean, with chiseled stern features and a stoic expression. His black, multi-tongued crown was studded with crystal flowers we had seen in the asphodel meadows. His bident stood erect, within reach should he have need of it. Persephone herself was stunningly beautiful, luminously resplendent amongst the gloom of the underworld. Her slender form did nothing to diminish her presence's gravitas. Her long, pale blonde hair gleamed like white gold, crowned with a coronet of woven crystal flowers. Her aura, brighter and warmer and more energetic than anything else in the underworld, marked her as a foreigner to her own kingdom. But I suddenly understood why her subjects loved her, why Hades loved her. She made their world brighter just by being here. The Summerland was no doubt darker for her absence. Her smile was the brightest light they ever saw, her laughter their greatest music. Her mere existence was a reminder that a better reality existed somewhere. It was possible to return to it, even after having fallen into hell. This effect seemed even stronger upon Genevieve, who immediately began to grovel and weep.
Hail, hail, fair maiden goddess, goddess of the spring and dawn and waxing moon, ever young avatar of the great triple goddess, goddess of new life and queen of the underworld.
She sobbed in a faint whisper.
Most blessed art thou, most hallowed art thou, most. I am humbled and grateful to be in your presence, fairest Persephone.
The goddess arched her eyebrow in slight amusement, but seemed unmoved by Genevieve's display of piety.
It's dread, Persephone.
She corrected her, sounding slightly annoyed.
And my husband's here too, you know. To disrespect him is to disrespect me.
Genevieve shook with terror at having displeased her goddess and appeared incapable of responding. So, for her, I stood up and bowed to Hades. Hades Pluton, Lord of the underworld and Zeus Chthonic, King of the realm invisible. Thank you for granting us this audience, I said. My name is...
Samantha.
Persephone smiled, her eyes lighting up with recognition as she shifted upright in her throne. You know me? I stammered, completely dumbfounded that the queen of the underworld knew who I was.
Of course. You're the dabbler who's taken up residence in the Heroic Cemetery. I do keep track of the astral nexuses I created, and I was fully expecting that one to fade out after I'd claimed the last of that bloodline. What a delightful surprise it was when you found it and claimed it as your own. Congratulations on making it down here, by the way. It's been nearly 5 years since anyone's made an Orphean trek, and I wasn't even here. The deathless merchant of London came to retrieve a business associate of his. Can you believe that? He journeyed to Hades not for love or glory or divine secrets, but to fulfill a contractual obligation. Truly bizarre. Oh, but I won't waste your time with anecdotes. I have other business to attend to, and I'm certain you don't want to be down here any longer than absolutely necessary. You've made it this far, so say what you've come here to say.
I nodded, swallowed nervously, and stepped as close to the dais as I dared. This past Hallows Eve, in the unnamed cemetery of Heroic Woods, a man offered himself to your wisps as a sacrifice, and his soul now resides here, I began. He only did this because you, or those working at your behest, had tormented him and his family. I, therefore, assert his sacrifice was coerced and not done freely, and that you have no rightful claim upon him. It was his ancestor, not him, who promised his soul to you, and that was not theirs to barter with. He was my friend, and it pains me to know that he is to suffer here for all eternity. For both his sake and mine, I ask for your pity, and that you release him from this realm. I stopped, because that was all I had. Challenging the queen of the underworld may not have been the best tactic, but I really didn't know what else to do. Persephone herself didn't appear to be particularly moved either.
You still don't even know his name, do you?
She asked, a tone of derision in her voice.
He was not your blood or your lover, merely a vagrant who happened to share your affinity for cemeteries, whom you knew for less than a month. That hardly seems like a loss worth upending the natural order of life and death to rectify.
Yes, he was only a friend, but that is not a title I give out lightly, I replied. But I'm not asking you to do it for me. I'm asking that he be released for no other reason than his damnation here is unjust.
Samantha, when your friend's ancestor made their bargain with me, they became one of my subjects, a citizen of the underworld.
Persephone explained.
Surely you're not arguing it's an injustice that citizenry is hereditary? By that logic, your own citizenship to your earthly nation is an injustice. Your friend and his entire bloodline were my subjects. I had every right to demand that they return here upon their deaths and to punish them for disobedience. The truth is that none of us consent to our own creation, and for good or ill, we are forever bound by the actions of those who came before us. Your friend is no exception. I have every right to his soul, and I will not be releasing him."
Angry tears began to well in my eyes. I impotently clenched my fists, restraining myself from screaming. "He didn't do anything," I persisted. "His wife, his child, who you killed didn't do anything. How can I accept any ruling you make as just, when you would condemn an innocent child to this hell for all eternity?" It was then that Hades first stirred on his throne. His indifference shifted to indignation at my display of insolence. His hand poised to grab his bident in a blink of an eye. The rest of the court adopted their lord's demeanor and stood at the ready. They were prepared to strike me down should I take one more step out of line. Even Cerberus was growling at me. I didn't want to find out what it felt like to be ripped apart by those 3 sets of jaws. Persephone, however, grabbed her husband's hand. She held up her free palm to tell the court to stand down. She gave me a weary nod, a nod of a god well accustomed to accusations that they were not all benevolent.
"Samantha, I realize this may offend your modern egalitarian sensibilities. Obtaining entry into the Earth Mother's Summerland or the Sky Father's Empyrean requires meeting certain moral and spiritual criteria, which not everyone does. And these are not arbitrary standards on their part either. Astral bodies are governed by karma just as physical bodies are by gravity. Unworthy souls are simply not capable of ascending to or remaining in the higher regions of the astral plane. Were it not for the underworld, they would remain earthbound poltergeists. Not only would such a vast number of restless spirits on Earth cause untold havoc, but their collective presence would weaken the veil enough that the physical constants of your world would be noticeably less constant. This would render all the science and technology based upon them useless. Earth would be a demon-haunted world, both literally and figuratively, and it is only thanks to the underworld that my husband and I maintain that it is not. Worse yet, some of those souls would be at risk of falling even lower than Earth, into Tartarus or the darkness below. I assure you that would be a far worse fate than anything that exists in this realm. This is not a prison. It is a poorhouse. We take in the spiritually destitute, but we are not the cause of their destitution. For both their sake and the sake of Earth, we maintain an astral realm where those unworthy of paradise may seek shelter. But it was not us who made them unworthy of it. As with any poorhouse, not everyone here is happy, but some do make better use of our charity than others. And make no mistake, it is charity. A necessary yet often thankless service that we provide, a task we would abstain from if we lacked fairness. And that, young dabbler, is why you can trust that my ruling is fair.
I calmed down, just a little bit. She was naturally persuasive, and the court of the damned at her beck and call didn't help. I got the impression that she at least believed what she was saying, but I wasn't willing to give up. But surely a person's karma isn't fixed upon their death, I asked. Can the shades of the underworld not still become worthy of ascending to a better afterlife? Is there anything at all, I can do to help my friend? I pleaded. Please. A cold, calculating glare overtook Persephone's face. In that moment, I knew that she was not thinking about whether or not it was possible, but whether or not to tell me.
As it stands, your friend is not worthy of ascending to the Summerland, and I see no reason to let him roam free upon the earth,
she said at last.
Go back to your body, dabbler. Study your craft, and perhaps one day you may be able to change my mind.
No! Persephone, please don't send me back empty-handed, I screamed. This can't all have been for nothing. I'm not going back without him. Enough, she said briskly, giving a slight commanding gesture to her husband. Hades rose from his throne, bident in hand. His eyes burned brighter as the rest of him darkened like a storm cloud. I froze in horror as he lunged towards me, his bident poised to strike. I have no idea what would have happened if it hit me, because in that instant, Genevieve sprung back to life. She threw her arms around me, commanding us both to wake up. Our eyes shot open. We were back in our bodies in the cemetery, gasping for breath and hearts pounding out of our chests. Despite the adrenaline rush, the horrors of what I'd just seen, and the consequences of my unsuccessful deal with Persephone immediately overwhelmed me. I fell to the ground, curled up into a ball, and just started sobbing.
Samantha,
Genevieve cried, rushing to my side. She cradled me in her arms.
Samantha, are you okay?
No, I squeaked with a pathetic shake of my head. I failed. My astral trip to the underworld was a turning point in my life, more so than anything else that came before. In the months that I had spent in the cemetery studying the ancestors' occult library, there was still a nagging voice in the back of my head. It said I was crazy, and none of it was real. But once I had actually managed to astral project and visit the spirit world, those doubts were gone for good. The astral plane was real, and if anything, the physical plane was the fantasy world. This revelation sparked a passion in me, unlike anything I'd felt before. Mastering the craft became the driving purpose in my life. Genevieve was the best teacher I could have hoped for. She helped me understand that being a good witch also meant being a good Wiccan. My earlier attempts at solitary study had been hindered by being overly analytical. Genevieve taught me that faith is not the rejection of reason, merely the acknowledgement of its limitations. Properly honed intuitions and emotions, crafted by millions of years of natural selection, can be just as powerful for inferring truth. This is especially true when there is not the required time or evidence for rational analysis, or when dealing with other worlds, which, by their very nature, do not conform to our laws. The fact that I had only first succeeded in astral projection when the Delphi dream had granted me a much more intuitive state of mind was all the proof I needed that it was the better approach to understanding the spirit world. I have an altar now, a small oak table draped in a purple velvet triple moon tapestry. It's light enough that I can move it around the cemetery when I want to, but I usually keep it in the maintenance shed where it won't get wet. On it, I have candles for fire, incense for air, salt and gemstones for earth, and a filled chalice for water. I have my athame, feathers from the crows in my cemetery, a wand made from a willow branch, a small cauldron, mortar, and pestle, my book of shadows, and a pentacle talisman. There are 2 small busts, one of the mother goddess and one of the horned god, and 2 figurines, the crone with a staff and cloak, and winged Isis, who I worship as an amalgam of all 3 goddesses. I do not, however, have any idol of the maiden goddess on my altar, for reasons which I expect are clear. Every day now, I kneel by my altar. I light the candles, burn the incense, and pray. Genevieve also helped me to realize that the purpose of prayer is not that a god answers, or even that there is a literal entity who identifies as the god you're praying to hear them. All forms of magic are based on the effect consciousness has on reality, and praying helps to clearly crystallize your thoughts and desires in your mind, and repetition reinforces them. Words are thoughts given physical form, and speaking or writing them helps make them more real. Genevieve and I are also great believers in the oneness and interconnectedness of all things, and that spells and prayers spread out through that interconnectedness to influence reality, including the God we're praying to if we're lucky. It's nothing short of ironic that after realizing all this was when a goddess actually did choose to acknowledge my prayers. It was June of last year, about 3 months after I had visited the underworld. Genevieve and I had gone on astral journeys many times since then, but I refused to go anywhere near the portal behind the tree line, be it in spirit or in the flesh. I had just stepped out of my shed when I saw a blonde woman sitting in a lawn chair by my fire pit, my cat Moxley on her lap. For a second, I just assumed it was Genevieve. Because who else would it be? But Genevieve doesn't drive or own a car, and even if she did, she wouldn't be able to find the cemetery on her own. I was still the only person I knew who could do that. "Hey!" I shouted, stomping towards her. The anger that anyone had dared to trespass into my sacred cemetery, overriding any sense of caution. The woman looked up at me and smiled. The same smug smile I had seen countless times from the portrait in the mausoleum, and I froze in my tracks. It was Persephone. She looked a little different from when I had seen her in the underworld. Her skin was sun-kissed, her hair crowned in a coronet of actual flowers instead of gemstones, and she was now clad in only a gossamer summer dress.
"Hey to you too."
She smirked, gently stroking Moxley's fur.
"How's your summer been? Mine's been dreadfully dull, but all my summers are like that. I miss my kingdom. I miss my king. I miss my dog. Like Mark Twain, I go to heaven for the climate and hell for the company."
"Dread Persephone," I murmured softly as I bowed in obligatory reverence to her, terrified at what she might be planning on doing.
"Actually, Fairest Persephone is fine now, given the season,"
she assured me.
"though I do appreciate the reminder of my proper honorific."
"How are you here?" I asked, bewildered. From everything I thought I understood about the elder kin, they shouldn't be able to cross the veil except at liminal times and places.
Let's call it reverse astral projection. My astral form is in the Summerland, but I'm projecting my mind into a rudimentary physical body I made from ambient matter,
she said nonchalantly.
"It's hard even with a weakened veil, and I could have just projected an image into your mind had I just wanted to talk, but I thought I should pay this nexus of mine a visit. Even after all this time, it really is quite charming. I can see why you love it so much. Come now, don't just stand there. Sit by my side and we'll talk a bit. I think it would be good for us to talk here, instead of in the far more formal setting of my court. Don't you?"
I nodded and sat down in the chair adjacent to her. It was a rare opportunity to actually be able to converse with a deity, and I wasn't going to waste it. "Are you what Genevieve thinks you are?" I asked curiously.
"An emanation of a specific aspect from a panpsychic, pantheistic Brahmin oversoul? Words, words, words."
She chuckled.
"I think this guy father said it best with, 'I am that what I am.' If it appeals to any lingering materialism you may still possess, you can think of the universe as a simulation and me as a mod. But that's still just a metaphor, and no more or less valid than the metaphors used by the most primitive shamans. But the answer to, 'What am I?' will always be beyond your understanding."
I nodded again and decided not to waste my limited time with her with any more metaphysics. "Then explain this to me then. Why can't you just let me have my friend back?" I asked, my voice cracking a bit as I did so. "I'm not arguing whether you have the authority to keep him. I'll admit that you do. But why do you care? I'm not even asking for him to be brought back to life. I just want his soul. What does one soul mean to you?" She drew pensive, seemingly considering her response very carefully.
"Identity is very important to my people, Samantha. Far more so than it is to mortals. The astral plane is far more malleable to thought than this world is, and thus our bodies are much more accurate reflections of our true nature. Before I was the queen of the underworld, I was nothing more than my mother's daughter. In her mind and the minds of many others, she is the perfect mother and ideal of feminine authority. She is selfless to the point of self-destruction when need be, viewing her power solely as a responsibility and never as a privilege, incapable of being corrupted or diluted by it. She is the embodiment of pure compassion and lives only to care for others. But to live under such a benefactor can be smothering and infantilizing, and that was to be my fate for all eternity. I was her daughter, to care for and dote over and most of all, to protect. I was to spend my eternity in the Summerland, where I'd be safe, helping the mortal souls who came there for respite and reflection from the cycle of rebirth until they were ready to return to Earth or ascend higher yet. That was to be my only reward for my toil. The warm, fuzzy feeling of knowing I helped people. I didn't even have to worry about screwing it up, since my mother would always be hovering over me, ready to correct any mistakes her hapless, idiot daughter made. She loves me. I know she does. But she did not respect me. When I told her that I wasn't as selfless as her and that I wasn't happy with the life she had ordained for me, she just assured me I would grow out of it, that she knew me better than I knew myself, and that she knew what was best for me. She wanted me safe, and I wanted to be free, the most proverbial parent-child conflict of them all. My growing unhappiness did start to impact her own sense of identity, however, as I was making it increasingly difficult for her to view herself as a perfect mother, and my rebellions against her only made that worse. In particular, she viewed herself as extremely progressive and permissive, and it harmed none. Do as thou wilt, right? As such, I was free to frolic with gods and goddesses, nymphs and satyrs, and any mortal souls in any combination and manner that pleased me. Then I fell in love with the Lord of the Underworld, and she did not like that one bit.
May I ask why? I interrupted.
Same reason most people don't like him, I imagine.
She shrugged.
He tends to the lost souls those of us on the higher levels of the astral plane would prefer not to think about.
No, I mean, why did you fall in love with him? I clarified, and pondering whether she had legitimately misunderstood me, or if she had been trying to deflect the question.
Oh, well then, and now, I view love more as a primordial force than a rational choice, one even the gods are powerless to resist. It just happened. But if I must give reasons, I admired the quiet dignity with which he conducted his thankless work, the paradise he had made in hell. He also gave me something I could never get from my mother. Respect. He never spoke down to me, always treated me as an adult and equal. I respected him in turn, and was willing to become his queen and aid him in his work, which I deemed far more rewarding than playing guidance counselor to the blessed souls of the Summerland. My mother, of course, was devastated at my choice to spend eternity in the gloomy underworld with its lost souls. She did everything in her power to rescue me, to save me, and when she couldn't, she viewed herself as a complete failure as a mother and fell into a deep depression, and the entire Summerland began to decay with her. It was partially a Fisher King scenario and partially because she was neglecting her duties that no one else could do. I was her main assistant, and I was gone. The crone is wise but old and limited in the amount of work she can do. My father, the horned god, is obedient to my mother to the point that he's usually useless without her giving him orders. But like all my people, his identity is essential to his existence, and his identity is that of the ideal son, lover, and father, willing to do anything to protect and provide for his family, even die. So that's what he did. It's hard to describe what he did in literal terms, but he made a sacrifice that saved the Summerland, but simultaneously made him unworthy of it, and he descended to the underworld. I hadn't quite realized things had gotten that bad without me, that my mother couldn't be the mother without me as the maiden. I hated being the maiden, though, and I loved being queen of the underworld, but how could I, in good conscience, keep my throne knowing that my mother, already in the grip of crippling depression, had just lost her beloved consort because she couldn't attend to her duties? The astral plane needed both the Summerland and the underworld, and the Summerland needed the maiden goddess. But the underworld could survive without a queen. If I were as selfless as my mother, I would have returned to the Summerland forever. But I'm not, so I didn't. Instead, I proposed a compromise. I would not forsake my identity as the maiden goddess, but nor would I forsake my preferred identity as the queen of the underworld. I would forever be of both worlds and split my time between the two. My mother accepted these terms, and I returned to the Summerland. With me by my mother's side, it was healed enough that what my father had sacrificed could be restored to him, and he was resurrected come spring. My mother still doesn't really approve of my life choices, but she accepts them, and though she misses me dearly, she is able to maintain the Summerland during my absence, knowing we'll be reunited again on Beltane. So you see, Samantha, I, like many gods, have a dichotomy to my existence. Between fairest Persephone and dread Persephone, between the dutiful daughter and the rebel daughter, between the Disney princess and the Disney queen.
She held out 2 fingers, whistled, and a chirping songbird came and perched upon them. With a sinister smirk, she blew upon it, and it instantly fell dead to the ground.
Compassion for its own sake is a trait of fairest Persephone, and any indulgence in compassion in my capacity as queen of the underworld compromises that identity. My preferred identity, the one I made for myself and will maintain until the end of time, no matter what the cost. You have offered me no reason to return your friend to you other than pity, and it takes an enormous amount of pity for me to be willing to act as fairest Persephone while I sit by my husband's side. Don't get me wrong, it is sweet that you care about your friend this much, but you're no Orpheus mourning for Eurydice.
I sat silently, contemplating what she had said. That all sounded like a very convoluted way of saying you just don't want to, I muttered, hanging my head.
I suppose it is.
She smirked.
I understand if that explanation doesn't bring you any comfort, but I have some questions for you now, if you don't mind.
And what would those be? I asked.
Well, Samantha, I know that since you came to see me, you've been exploring these woods, both on and off the trails, wondering if there was any truth to the old legends you read about. You found the Green Man, didn't you?
The Green Man is a nature spirit that resides in and watches over heroic woods. He usually takes the form of a tall, sylvan satyr. With my clairvoyance, he wasn't hard to find once I started looking. I admitted, not seeing any point in lying, even though I suspected I knew where she was going with this.
How could you not? He'd be very hard for someone like you to miss.
She noted.
And being a devotee of my father, he would have been all too eager to aid a witch. I can only imagine the first thing you would have asked him was how to help your friend. And I'm sure his first suggestion was to make him your spirit familiar. That way, he'd be anchored to you and unable to descend back to the underworld. And in your service, he might even be able to rack up enough karma to ascend to the Summerland someday. Am I wrong?
I sighed, but gave a resigned nod. That's exactly what he had told me.
But as much as you miss your friend, you haven't tried anything yet.
She went on.
I assume then that you're waiting until Halloween, when the veil is weakest, and when I, hopefully, am distracted by my welcome home party. I've come here to tell you that's not going to work, Samantha. I've made my decision. I know what you're up to, and I will not be made a fool of. I admire your persistence. Really, I do, but do not think for an instant that you can defy me. You think that just because you've read some old grimoires, walked across the plains, and danced naked around a bonfire with your little girlfriend that you're an all-powerful witch? You are a dabbler, and any expertise you think you may possess is pure Dunning-Kruger effect. You don't have the slightest idea how much you don't know, how much you cannot understand. If you try to trick me or steal from me, you will fail, and, for reasons I've already explained, I will not be merciful. This is not a threat. This is a warning. I like you, and I don't want to have to punish you, but I will if you attempt to circumvent my ruling. If you really want me to release him to you as a familiar, continue to study your craft until you advance enough that you can actually offer me something worthy in exchange. I believe you have that in you, Samantha, and it's something I'd actually be willing to agree to.
Well, I don't think I'd be willing to agree to a deal on your terms. Knowing what I know about you, I said adamantly, I don't want to be your subject. I don't want to end up in your underworld, and I sure as hell don't want to condemn any innocent descendants I may have to that fate. You may be a goddess, but you're not God with a capital G. You're not all-powerful or even supremely powerful, and you're not the sole arbiter of the fate of mortal souls. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not giving in to you, and if I do save my friend, it will be on my terms, not yours. Go to hell. Now please. I grimaced as she picked up Moxley and held him to her face, presumably contemplating killing him just to punish me for my outburst.
You're lucky it's summer and you're cute,
she told him before setting him down on the ground. She then looked up at me with pity that I knew I would not receive should I cross her while she was not under her mother's thumb.
If you ever change your mind about that, just holler, and I swear I won't hold anything against you,
she assured me before dissipating into a spray of mist. I scooped Moxley up in my arms and clutched him to my chest, nuzzling his head while sobbing, wondering what the hell I had just done. I had no real reason to believe I could ever defy Persephone, and every reason to believe that bending to her whim was my only hope of helping my friend. But as I said, I was committed to trusting my intuition now, and my intuition told me I was missing something. I felt that something was off, that something didn't quite make sense, and I was just on the cusp of my conscious mind realizing what it was. I felt then, and know now, that I was only one more epiphany or revelation away from being able to rescue my friend, with or without Persephone's approval. I just hoped that I would have that epiphany before the next Halloween. Summer slipped by without me making any visible progress in my quest. My goal was to turn my deceased friend into a spirit familiar, an action that went against Persephone's wishes. It was only on a late September night that I found a hint. Genevieve and I decided to have dinner and a couple of craft beer pints at a Queen Street tavern named the Undying Rose. I'm not much of a nightlife enthusiast, but this place was calm. It boasted a beer garden that overlooked the Avalon River. We had to share a dish, though. Despite its elegant name, I was convinced their primary clientele were robust, straight guys weighing over 200 pounds. What intrigued me about this place was its name and the logo, a dark purple rose. You might remember that the rose left on the ancestor's grave was also purple and seemingly immortal. Upon realizing this, I replanted the rose. To my pleasure, it took root and sprouted into a small bush. However, something started nagging at me. In the ancestors' books, I could find no reference to it despite my thorough research. Considering how detailed they were in recording their occult activities, this absence struck me as odd. I surmised it might have been acquired by a later descendant. The Undying Rose Tavern rekindled my curiosity. Fortunately, the owner was present that night. I inquired about the history and name of his establishment. He mentioned it dated back to the early 19th century, but the precise date and original proprietor were lost in the mists of time. Despite changes in ownership, the name remained the Undying Rose. I thanked him and spent the rest of the night pondering the implications. Could it be that the tavern once belonged to my friend's ancestor? And could the name refer to the rose from the graveyard? But why? Afterwards, Genevieve and I decided to spend the night at my cemetery. I had only had 2 pints over a couple of hours, and my stomach was full. I was sober enough to drive. Back home, We smoked some weed, made love, and drifted into a deep, satisfying sleep. It was indeed a pleasant night. However, during my sleep, I had a recurring dream. It was the same dream I had the first night I spent in the cemetery, and it seemed to hint at something I was missing. The ancestor, shrouded and performing a ritual to turn the cemetery into an astral nexus, and then resting at the very center. Suddenly, it dawned on me. The ancestor stood exactly where the mausoleum now stands. But the mausoleum wasn't there initially. It was constructed after the ancestor hallowed the cemetery. But for what purpose? While it ostensibly was a tribute to Hades and Persephone, I was convinced there was an ulterior motive. I awoke suddenly, just before sunrise. The epiphany I had been waiting for was finally clear in my mind. I knew what I had to do. Evie, get dressed, I instructed her, shaking her awake and hurriedly donning my clothes.
What? Why?
She asked sleepily. I need your help. Right now, I declared. You need shoes, your sunglasses, and as much protection as you can muster. Before she could probe further, I was already out the door, heading to the maintenance shed. I put on my gardening gloves, safety goggles, and picked up a pair of rusty old sledgehammers.
Wait, Samantha, stop. What are we doing?
Genevieve queried, chasing after me. We need to see what's entombed in the mausoleum, I explained, marching resolutely towards it.
Entombed in the... You mean we're smashing it open?
She queried, aghast.
But why?
I dreamt about the cemetery being hallowed again. Only this time I realized the mausoleum wasn't there initially, I explained. The occultist erected the mausoleum afterward, and I believe they had a specific reason for doing so. There's something crucial inside that tomb, and we need to discover what it is.
Hold on. Baby, slow down.
She implored.
This could be dangerous. We might upset Persephone by desecrating the tomb, or it might be protected by some occult mechanism. And what about you? You love this place. Are you really willing to vandalize it?
Her words stopped me in my tracks. I paused by the mausoleum door, mulling over her argument. I have to know for sure, I replied grimly, fully aware I was echoing what my friend had said when I caught him digging up the ancestor's grave. I pushed the door open, threw off the tablecloth covering the tomb, and immediately set to work smashing it open. Genevieve and I aren't exactly ideally built for that sort of manual labor, but we pummeled the top slab of marble until it was in small enough pieces for us to remove by hand. When the tomb was finally open, we beheld a body wrapped entirely in a scarlet burial shroud embroidered with golden sigils.
What the hell? That shroud looks brand new.
Genevieve remarked.
How is that possible if it's been rotting here for 200 years?
I didn't answer. In fact, I barely registered she said anything. I was mesmerized by the pristine shroud, the implications for the body beneath it all too clear. Evie, brace yourself, I cautioned as I pulled back the shroud, revealing the perfectly preserved body of an elderly man. His skin had the exact same pale, silvery pallor as my friend. His hair, bushy with a prominent widow's peak, was just as white, along with a pointed beard and long handlebar mustache. He had a pronounced pointed nose and sunken cheeks, and his bony fingers clutched a leather-bound book and purple rose to his chest.
An incorruptible corpse, like the one you said your friend dug up?
Genevieve asked in wonder. I nodded and slowly pulled the book out of the corpse's hands. Other than being room temperature, it didn't feel like a dead body at all. I succeeded in freeing the book, and when I opened it, my eyes began to tear up with joy at what I saw on the first page. The Journal of Artaxerxes Crow, I read aloud. My voice flooded with pride, satisfaction, and relief.
Artaxerxes?
Genevieve asked in disbelief.
Wait, Crow, as in Crow, Crowley, and Chamberlain, the old financial firm on Druid Street?
Almost certainly, I said softly, though I was hardly concerned with that at the time. Evie, this is my friend's ancestor, the occultist who made the deal with Persephone and created this place. I knew it didn't make sense that he would be buried in some random grave. The first time my friend told me that, I knew it didn't make sense. He was on the right track, though. That must have been what drove him to dig up the grave.
But then, who's buried out there?
No idea. Just someone Artaxerxes sacrificed to the wisps in his place, I surmised. Genevieve. I don't know how he did it, or even exactly what he did, other than that it involves the roses and the mausoleum in some way. But somehow he cheated Persephone. He condemned every one of his descendants to a fate that he weaseled out of. The bastard.
This is unreal.
Genevieve murmured with an incredulous shake of her head. When she was finally able to pull her eyes away from the body, she saw that I had a broad grin plastered across my face.
Samantha, baby, why are you smiling?
His soul is still in there. Can't you feel it? I asked. I hadn't noticed it at first either, but I could clearly sense the presence of a soul within the corpse. He's astral projecting, but his soul is still bound to his earthly vessel, which is why he hasn't fallen into the underworld, despite being such an epic piece of shit. He's literally been evading divine justice for centuries.
So why are you smiling?
Genevieve repeated. Persephone is going to want to make Artaxerxes pay for what he did, I whispered, gesturing to her portrait. She made it very clear to me that she will not tolerate being tricked or cheated. She'll want him, and she can have him, for a price. Genevieve stared at me aghast, like I'd just gone completely insane.
You're saying you're going to ask Persephone for your friend back in exchange for this asshole?
She asked, bewildered. Not ask. Demand, I said resolutely. We'll set up wards that the elderkin can't cross, like last Halloween. And if Persephone won't agree to my terms, then she's out of luck. Genevieve took a step back, her body quaking at my proposed sacrilege.
Samantha, baby, I really don't know about this.
She murmured.
I love you, but Persephone is still the maiden goddess. Still our goddess. Forcing her hand like that seems disrespectful and dangerous. Maybe we should just let Persephone have him, and she can decide if and how to reward us.
For a moment, I was hurt. She knew how much this meant to me. And now that I finally had an ace in the hole, she just wanted me to give it up. But I knew how much her faith meant to her, and that I really was asking a lot. I understand, I said, hanging my head in resignation. And I'll understand if you don't want to have anything to do with this. But that's not going to stop me. I'm a Wiccan now too, and I do want to revere and respect all incarnations of our goddess. But there's still a humanistic streak in me that thinks standing up to a tyrannical god who could torture me for all eternity is the most righteous act I could ever do. Goddess or not, Persephone wronged a fellow human being that I called my friend. And if I can hold her accountable for that, I will. Genevieve just stood there, tears welling in her eyes. I could tell she wanted to talk me out of it, but knew that she couldn't. I could tell she wanted to tell me that she wouldn't have any part in it, but knew that she couldn't do that either. She looked at me, then at the portrait of Persephone, and then back to me.
Fuck it. The great thing about being a polytheist is that if you piss one god off, you got plenty more to choose from.
We spent the next few weeks preparing for our Halloween party. We consulted our occult tomes and readied everything we would need. Soon, Samhain was upon us. I had turned Moxley into my animal familiar as practice, and it went off without a hitch. We both became able to communicate with each other much more intuitively, even when we were apart if one of us wanted to, and he developed a very uncat-like obedience to my instructions. I left him at Genevieve's house for safety with her animal familiar, a black cat named Nightshade, both of whom were to be taken care of as part of Genevieve's estate should we not return. We could tell both of them knew something was up, and they were worried. But they obeyed our orders to stay at the house. After a heartfelt goodbye with our darling kitties, we set out for the cemetery. We had carved a large triple moon sigil into the ground with a pentagram for a full moon, and filled the lines with black salt. There were 12 jack-o'-lanterns, one for each point on the pentagram, and one to sit between the tips of each crescent moon. They weren't carved with faces, though. but with carefully selected sigils and glyphs meant to ward off chthonic or ill-meaning spirits and ensure the protection of the mother goddess and horned god. We had similar sigils drawn on our bodies or inscribed on our clothes. We both wore pentagram talismans and pointed hats, serving both as festive costumes and ceremonial attire. I had selected a long, flowing black dress for the occasion, whereas Genevieve, who cannot abide restrictive clothing, wore only a deep green mini dress. My hair was half a foot longer than it had been a year before. I hadn't cut it in all that time since I thought a witch should have long, beautiful hair, and a witch was what I was now. Within the center of the pentagram were myself, Genevieve, and the incorruptible corpse of Artaxerxes Crow. I had brought my altar out as well, along with the addition of the jack-o'-lantern-shaped candle holder I had placed on my friend's memorial nearly a year ago. It was our lucky 13th jack-o'-lantern, and I had drawn a sigil on it as well. It was what I intended to bind my friend to, should I succeed in freeing him from the underworld. As soon as the sun set, we began our rituals, lighting the hallowed virgin candles in their hollowed pumpkins. We danced, chanted, and prayed, recited oral spells, and burned written ones in the candle flames. This went on for nearly 2 hours until dusk finally fell. When the veil was the weakest, it would be all year, and the will of the wisps began to appear over the gravestones. Persephone would now be able to come here in her astral form, and all I had to do was summon her. It is All Hallows' Eve, and the great god Pan is dead, I pontificated. I grabbed my walking stick that I had engraved with sigils and topped with a crescent moon, a string of select gemstones dangling from the upper tip. The god of the hunt and harvest has sacrificed himself to ensure the survival of his people. We thank and praise him for this sacrifice, and grieve with the mother goddess at the loss of her consort. As the horned god descends into the underworld, so too doth the maiden, so that she may take her rightful seat by Hades' side, and grant her father dispensation to be resurrected once again come spring. But before she sits upon her obsidian throne, I would like to have a word with her. I drew the invocation sigils into the dirt with my stave, and Genevieve filled it with white salt crystals. Dread, Persephone, Summer Maiden, and Winter Queen, heed my summons under waxing crescent, to cross the veil on this Halloween, and greet me in my presence. For as speaking of things that need bespoke, from this moment hence, thy powers do I thus invoke. Let our bargaining commence. As soon as I had finished the spell, there was a bright blue flash from behind the tree line, where the spirit portal was, and seconds later the astral form of Persephone came marching forth, the wisps reverently lowering themselves to the ground in her presence.
Persistent as ever, aren't we, Samantha?
She said as she came to a stop behind the protective wards we had made.
At least you're not trying to steal from me. All right then, I'll humor you for a moment. What little trick have you learned that you think might be worth me giving you your friend back?
No tricks. A treat, I smiled. I bent down and pulled off Artaxerxes' burial shroud. Recognize this guy? Finally, I saw that smug smile leave her face as she just stared completely dumbfounded.
That's,
she murmured. Artaxerxes Crow, I finished for her. Body and soul. If I'm not mistaken, he agreed to sacrifice both of those to your wisps in exchange for your services. He cheated you, Persephone, made a fool of you, which I do recall you saying were things that you wouldn't tolerate. She attempted to cross the outer circle to seize him, but the wards held firm.
Give him to me,
she ordered, her face distorting in otherworldly rage. I'm not one of your subjects or followers, Persephone. You have no authority over me, I proclaimed. If you want Artaxerxes, it will be on my terms. She glared at me in wrath and shock, but then let out an acquiescent snicker.
All right. Fine. You win. Give me Artaxerxes, and you can have your friend as a familiar.
Not good enough, I told her. You need to forfeit your claim on every single one of Artaxerxes' descendants, and let any that are able to leave the underworld leave."
"What?"
she growled, an enraged expression returning to her face. "Artaxerxes broke the terms of your agreement. That means the entire contract is invalid, and you no longer have any right to those souls. Release them, and you can have him," I replied.
"You want me to give up 7 generations of descendants for one man? That's nearly 12 dozen souls."
"My conditions are non-negotiable. Take them or leave them," I said coldly. Persephone screamed and howled, bashing at the invisible barrier that kept her at bay. I couldn't help but smirk, remembering how she had so condescendingly assured me that I had no idea what I was doing and that I would be powerless to defy her. After a minute, she managed to regain some composure, and I watched her eyes flitting back between me and Artaxerxes, trying to decide who she wanted to punish more.
"State your full terms."
She said at last, "You can have him if you swear, on the river Styx, to forsake your claim to all of Artaxerxes' descendants and release the blessed ones from the underworld," I answered. "To give me the name of the man who died here last year and let me bind him to me as a familiar, and that neither you or anyone at your behest will ever harm or harass me or my loved ones, or trespass in my cemetery."
"I swear on the river Styx to forsake my claim on all of Artaxerxes' descendants and to release the blessed ones from the underworld,"
she repeated.
"to give you the name of the man who died here last year and let you bind him to yourself as a familiar, and that neither myself or anyone at my behest will ever harm or harass you or your loved ones or trespass in your cemetery. Now give him to me."
Admittedly, this was a gamble. I wasn't entirely sure if an oath sworn on the river Styx was unbreakable, but it was a risk I had to take. Genevieve and I each picked up an end of the corpse, carried him to the edge of the wards, and threw him across. Persephone caught him with superhuman strength and agility, cradling him like a baby. A baby she intended to devour. A sadistic smile spread across her face. She cast me a wayward glance, and doubt crept into my mind. Had I made a terrible mistake?
"His name is Elam Crow,"
she sighed.
"Don't push your luck with me again, dabbler, or I swear, on the river Styx, that I'll find a way around my oath to make you pay for your insolence."
With those words, she took a single leap and was back through the portal, carrying Artaxerxes across the veil with her. I couldn't help but wonder at the physics of it all. How does one carry a physical body into the underworld? But that question wasn't my priority. I took my wand in hand and traced the sigil for Elam in the air 7 times. "Elam Crow," I shouted each time the sigil appeared. Then, kneeling by my altar, I grasped the jack-o'-lantern candle holder. "I, Samantha Sumner, the hedge witch of Heroic Woods, hereby invoke your presence and call you forth from the spirit world," I announced. "I offer you this vessel as an earthly binding to anchor your soul to the material plane. I offer you protection and shelter in return for your willing fealty as a familiar spirit. If you accept, heed my summons and come serve your lady. So mote it be." I knelt there, the tiny porcelain pumpkin in my lap. With each passing second, the fear grew. Had I done something wrong? Even on Halloween in an astral nexus, was I not powerful enough to summon a spirit?
"Samantha,"
Genevieve said, nodding her head behind me. I spun around. A humanoid astral form stood at the edge of the circle. Its features were hazy, indistinct. I wasn't sure if it was my friend or not. I approached it, holding the candle container across the barrier. The spirit touched it. Its features immediately solidified into those of my lost friend. An instant psychic connection ignited, just like the one I had with my cat. I knew, without a doubt, this was Elam. He was now safely bound to me and free of the underworld. Shock painted his face. He never expected to see me again. He never expected to see Earth again. His gaze flickered between me, the cemetery, and the sky, before finally uttering a barely audible but sincerely grateful,
"Thank you."
Tears of joy streamed down my face as I threw my arms around him. It was an embrace more genial than anything we had shared while he was alive. I pulled him into the circle where we'd be safe until the wisps vanished at midnight. Now he too began to weep. His tears were a mix of joy, relief, gratitude, and confusion.
Miss...
Samantha, I corrected him. You can call me Samantha now. Elam.
Samantha, why would you do this for me?
He asked, bewilderment lacing his gratitude. I smirked, still somewhat baffled by everyone's surprise at my determination to save Elam from the underworld. Because you're my friend, and I really don't understand why or care that no one else seems to think that that's reason enough. I told him, you needed me and I'm just sorry that it took me a whole year. Elam half laughed, half cried at my modest self-depreciation.
A year is a hell of a lot less than the eternity I was expecting.
He assured me.
I can never repay you for this, Samantha. Thank you. Thank you.
He was at a loss for words after that. The situation was understandably overwhelming. Genevieve and I sat with him in our spell circle, taking turns to update him on the past year's happenings. All the while, the horde of wisps hovered just beyond our ward of salt and pumpkins. And so, that's my story. Looking back at it, I've come to a realization. It wasn't a horror story. Yes, parts of it were horrifying, but in the end, I won. I uncovered arcane secrets about the spirit world, developed supernatural powers, found a home in a beautiful hidden cemetery, and found love. I even bent the queen of the underworld to my will, all for a friend. The experience left me more content and confident than ever. I wouldn't trade it for anything. Before all this, I considered myself an anti-nihilist. I believed that the lack of any objective meaning to the universe was liberating. It made everyone's subjective sense of meaning equally valid. That's why the existence of literal gods was initially horrifying to me. The idea that there were objective arbiters of meaning and morality. But when one of those gods did something I found immoral, I made her undo it. Gods or not, I proved that mortals aren't mere playthings. We have some agency over our fate, and that to me is the opposite of horror. Divination has since revealed that Persephone did keep her word. She released Artaxerxes' descendants, including Elam's young daughter Rosemary, who ascended to the Summerland. Elam was overjoyed, as you can imagine, and he hopes to join her there one day. I hope he does too. For now, though, he serves as my faithful familiar protecting Genevieve and me on our astral journeys and carrying out assigned tasks. He's free to come and go from the cemetery, but he's never failed to answer my summons. And, in case you were thinking it, he's always respected mine and Genevieve's privacy. As for me, I've started a new career as a part-time metaphysical counselor at Genevieve's Spiritual Wellness Center. I share my newfound expertise as a hedge witch with those who seek it. A few years ago, I wouldn't have pictured myself doing this. But it's been going well, even though I've mostly been doing it over Zoom. Working alongside Genevieve is a bonus. I never would have been able to save Elam without her. I'll forever be grateful for her guidance and love during a crucial time in my life. My life's been pretty mundane since last Halloween, but I don't expect that to last. Hallowed County can be a pretty weird place, and I'm sure there are more mysteries and anomalies left to uncover. Now, I have Artaxerxes' final journal, the one filled with secrets he took to the grave. It's brimming with untapped potential. The story of how I became the hedge witch of Hallowed Woods may be over, but it certainly won't be the last story of mine I decide is worth telling. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of tonight's chilling tale, Hallowed Ground. The complete story, parts 1 through 7, by the talented The Vespers Bell. I hope you've enjoyed our descent into darkness, and that you'll carry a piece of the Fearfile Chronicles with you as you drift into uneasy dreams. If our story left you shivering and shaking, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who crave a good scare, and subscribe to the Fear File Chronicles for more haunting horrors. Remember to hit the bell notification so you're always among the first to know when a new nightmare awaits. As always, we appreciate your support and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing your fears and frights with us truly means a lot, so don't be shy to engage with our sinister community. Until next time, remember to embrace the darkness, for it is within the shadows that our most terrifying stories are born. Good night, and stay scared.